The meeting will come to order. I'd like to welcome everyone to the California Technology Assessment Forum meeting, CTAF. We had a nice rehearsal this morning, and we're going to do it again, this time for asthma. My name is Dan Elliott. I'm the chair of CTAF, and to my right, Paul, raise your hand, please. Paul Heidenreich, vice chair. I'd like to introduce four new members of the panel. Ralph Brindis, cardiologist. Rena Fox, internal medicine. Luanda Grisette, cardiology, and Joy Melnikov, family medicine. Let me just say a word about CTAF. CTAF is a core program of ICER, and as such, reviews ICER-produced evidence-based reports on the effectiveness and value of healthcare services and provides a public venue for discussion among all stakeholders. CTAF's mission is to help patients, clinicians, insurers, and policymakers interpret and use evidence to improve quality and value of healthcare. CTAF's vision is to create a future in which collaborative efforts to move evidence into action becomes the foundation for a more effective, efficient, and just healthcare system. Our CTAF's conflict of interest policy is provided in your packet, and we ask all speakers, roundtable participants, and individuals making public comments to disclose any relationships with industry or any other potential conflicts of interest related to today's topic when they speak. All members of the CTAF panel have been asked to disclose conflicts of interest for this meeting, and none have been reported. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce our new program chairman, Matt Seidner. Matt has been a member of the ICER team since 2014 and has contributed to ICER reviews, including new treatments for hepatitis C, integration of behavioral health and primary care, and new interventions in the management of heart failure. Matt?
Thank you, Dan. I'd also like to welcome everybody to the CTAF public meeting on Mepolizumab for the treatment of severe asthma with eosinophilia. Thank you all for joining us. I'd also like to extend a thanks to our funders, the Blue Shield of California Foundation, the California Healthcare Foundation, and the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. As a brief reminder, we ask that you please put your cell phones on vibrate, and should you need them, restrooms are outside the room and down the hall past reception. We've distributed some materials to you all. The panel has an agenda for the day's events, a voting worksheet, voting questions, a PowerPoint presentation, key tables, and biographies for the policy roundtable members. And the audience should have an agenda and list of CTAF panel members with conflict of interest information, voting questions, and key tables from our review of Mepolizumab. For those of you on the webcast, these materials are available to you online at tinyurl.com/mepo, CTAF-mepo. I'd like to take a moment to go over our agenda for the afternoon. So we're convening now with a brief topic overview shortly from our senior fellow, Jed Weisberg, who I'll introduce in a moment. That will be followed by a presentation of the evidence and economic modeling and a question and answer session with the CTAF panel. The presentation will be given by Dr. Jeff Tice, Melanie Whittington, and Dr. Dan Ohlendorf. Following that, we will break for some public comments, and then we'll move on to the CTAF deliberation and vote on the key questions that are in your packets. After the deliberation and votes, we will invite the policy roundtable up to the central table to discuss the review and how we should best translate the evidence into practice and policy, and we'll follow that with reflections on the afternoon session from the CTAF panel. After that, Jed will send us off with a summary and closing remarks. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jed Weisberg, who will set the stage for today's discussion. Dr. Weisberg is a gastroenterologist who joined ICER as a senior fellow in 2014. He had a 30-year career at Kaiser Permanente, most recently as Senior Vice President for Hospitals, Quality, and Care Delivery Excellence, and also Medical Director for Medicare Advantage, Cost, and Prescription Drug Plans. Jed?
Thanks, Matt. For those of you new to a CTAF meeting or ICER work, you will see that we do rigorous, systematic reviews and presentation of the evidence with synthesis and meta-analysis as required or possible, followed by detailed economic analysis at both the individual and the care system level. We'll have that evidence presented, then an opportunity for our panel to ask questions and clarifying comments about that, and both our presenters and our clinical experts will be able to respond at that point. If there are any details or facts that our industry representatives can supply, we'll invite them to provide that information at that time. We'll have a much more broad-ranging conversation going beyond the presented available evidence during our roundtable, and we'll try to restrict our initial conversation and vote to the evidence as presented. Unfortunately, asthma remains a problem. Indeed, it is increasing as a problem in many segments of the population. And even though there are well-worked-out guidelines for suggesting how to treat severe asthma, patients continue to suffer, and there is a need for new agents. New agents are being developed all the time, and we're going to hear about one today that is directed at a particular cytokine. We're not going to delve into the basic science, but enough to let us know that there's something novel there. With that, I'd invite our evidence presenter, Jeff Tice, up to the podium.
Thanks, Jed, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Jeff Tice. I'll do the evidence review. I have no conflict of interests. Asthma is a common problem. There are about 22 million Americans affected by asthma. We're going to focus today on severe asthma, which is defined, at least loosely, as asthma with daily symptoms that are limiting to normal activities despite a maximal usual therapy. Patients often have 2 or more exacerbations a year that require rescue therapy with oral corticosteroids. The patients with severe asthma represent between 5 to 10% of all patients with asthma, so a minority, but they account for roughly 50% of all the costs. The standard treatment, as I mentioned, is inhaled corticosteroids plus a long-acting beta agonist. And there are a number of additional therapies that are then added and are helpful for some patients. These include leukotriene inhibitors, theophylline, and Mepolizumab. Oral corticosteroids are used for asthma exacerbations and chronically for patients with severe asthma that are unable to be controlled without oral corticosteroids. But we try and avoid them because of the many long-term complications associated with daily oral corticosteroid use. These range from higher risk for infections, diabetes, osteoporosis, to muscle problems, obesity, and a number of other side effects listed here. So we actively try to avoid oral corticosteroid use and limit its use as much as possible. So Mepolizumab is the compound that we're discussing today. It's a humanized monoclonal antibody to interleukin-5. It binds to interleukin-5, which decreases IL-5 signaling, leading to decreased eosinophils in both blood and tissue, in particular in the lungs and the airways. We have clinical experts here who can talk to you a lot more about the pathophysiology. There are a number of different phenotypes of severe asthma, and this phenotype, known as type 2, is one of the ones targeted by Mepolizumab. The FDA approved Mepolizumab in November of last year, and the dosing formulation that was approved is 100 milligrams delivered subcutaneously every 4 weeks in a physician's office. The drug actually has to be reconstituted in the office by staff, and in part because of concerns about hypersensitivity reactions patients were observed in the physician's office for a period of time. The indications from the FDA are patients 12 years and older with severe eosinophilic asthma, and eosinophilia in this case is defined by blood eosinophil levels of at least 150 cells per microliter at initiation, or documentation of eosinophil levels of at least 300 during the prior year. So we performed a systematic review following standard guidelines. The target population was the population indicated in the FDA indication for the medication. The intervention was primarily 100 milligrams of mepolizumab delivered subcutaneously, but many of the initial studies used a number of different IV formulations, and the 75 milligram IV formulation has very similar pharmacodynamics, and in part in response to public comments, we have highlighted those data a little bit more than in our initial draft. The comparator is essentially a standard therapy for severe asthma, so oral corticosteroids added to daily inhaled corticosteroids when needed, and other controller therapy. There are 3 primary randomized trials, double-blind randomized trials, as opposed to the unblinded trials this morning. The MENSA trial compared 100 milligrams subcutaneous mepolizumab or 75 milligrams IV to placebo. The trial enrolled 576 patients greater than 12 years and older who had had at least 2 asthma exacerbations in the prior year and followed them for 24 weeks, the primary outcome being a change in frequency of asthma exacerbations. The second trial is the SIRIUS trial, the same 100 milligram subcutaneous dose compared to placebo, in this case in patients requiring chronic oral corticosteroid use, so at least between 5 and 35 milligrams a day of oral corticosteroids at initiation. The patients also were required to be 12 years or older. And in this case, the follow-up was 36 weeks and 135 patients were randomized. Finally, there was an earlier trial, the DREAM trial, which did not use a subcutaneous formulation of mepolizumab, but did include the 75 milligram IV formulation, also a 250 and 750 milligram dosing, as well as a placebo group. There were 616 patients in this trial. Again, it was a trial of patients with at least 2 asthma exacerbations requiring at least 4 days of oral corticosteroid use over the prior year. This trial had longer follow-up, 52-week follow-up. So here are the primary results for asthma exacerbation rates. Again, the MENSA trial randomized, in this case, 194 patients to subcutaneous mepolizumab, and at the start, their annual rate of asthma exacerbations was 3.8 per 100 person years, and at the end of the trial, that was down to 0.8, so more than a 4-fold reduction in asthma exacerbation rates. Interestingly, in the placebo group, about the similar size, you had a reduction from 3.6 to 1.7, so more than a 50% reduction even in the placebo group, highlighting one of the importance of having good placebos in any of these trials to really quantify the effect of the drug. But compared to the placebo group, you still saw an additional 50% reduction in the rate of asthma exacerbations. So you had a 50% reduction with 100 milligrams subcutaneous. Similarly, you saw almost identical reductions for the 75 milligram IV formulation given also every 4 weeks. In the SIRIUS trial, you saw a 30% reduction in the active treatment arm versus placebo, and in the DREAM trial, you also saw a 50% reduction, in this case, of the 75 milligram dosing given IV compared to placebo. So 2 of the 3 trials, you saw very consistent 50% reduction, the third a 30% reduction compared to placebo. And again, the placebo group saw significant reductions in all cases. In terms of change in oral corticosteroid use, there's really only one trial, the SIRIUS trial, that carefully looked at this. The endpoint that's been highlighted is that the median dose reduction in patients treated with mepolizumab was 50%. So the middle person had a 50% reduction, so half of people had a 50% reduction in their steroid dose or greater. In the placebo group, the median reduction was 0. There was no reduction. But I also wanted to highlight the absolute doses and measured both as median and mean. So for this mepolizumab group, the daily dose went from 10 milligrams down to 3.1, and placebo group also went down from 12.5 but only to 10 milligrams. And that's looking at median measures as a median, so the 50th percentile. If you look at the average dose, the mean dose, it went from 12.4 to 8.6 in the Mepolizumab group and from 13.2 to 10.5 milligrams per day in the placebo group, and the differences are presented here. There were statistically significant reductions or improvements in quality of life using two standard quality of life instruments for asthma, the Asthma Control Questionnaire and the St. George's Respiratory Questionnaire. This was true across all three of the trials. However, the reductions were modest, so about equivalent. The average reduction was right at the borderline of what is accepted as clinically significant for each of these questionnaires. In terms of adverse reactions, there really weren't major differences. There were more injection site reactions in patients receiving mepolizumab versus placebo, so 8% versus 3%, but no differences in significant adverse events, no differences in hypersensitivity reactions, which were a concern injecting a biologic, whether particularly in patients who would be particularly vulnerable to a hypersensitivity reaction. There was not an increase in the clinical trials. There are concerns about opportunistic infections because we're reducing eosinophil activity. Eosinophils are part of the immune system. We think predominantly for parasitic infections, and in the clinical trials, patients with parasitic infections were excluded from the trials. But we don't see that parasitic infections often in the United States, so maybe not a big clinical issue here. There were nominally more herpes zoster infections. It's unclear if this is clinically significant or a random observation, but something that bears careful scrutiny going forward in the larger observational trials. In terms of effectiveness, the controversies around effectiveness, they're mainly around the small numbers of patients treated to date and the short duration. So in the Mensa trial, there were 194 participants who received the subcutaneous dosing. In the Sirius trial, 69 patients. In the other trials, there were IV formulations, which also give some information about harms, but is not the FDA-approved dosing regimen. The trials were also relatively short, 32 and 24 weeks respectively, so not a large number of people with long follow-up to observe unexpected or rare adverse outcomes. In addition, there are several key subgroups that are really too small to evaluate. African Americans have a higher incidence of both asthma and severe asthma, so very much a subgroup of interest. There were a total of 39 patients of African descent in the international trials here, so can't say anything with much certainty in that group. Similarly, although the trials recruited patients 12 years and older, there were only 27 patients between the ages of 12 and 17, so it's hard to say much about the pediatric population or the adolescent population. Many people think that this phenotype of severe asthma, particularly with eosinophilia, is a phenotype that develops over decades, and so it's not surprising that there were a few patients, young patients, who met the indications for the trial. But it does raise questions about extending coverage in these important subgroups. So in summary, there's moderate certainty of comparable or better net benefit for mepolizumab as an add-on therapy, add-on to maintenance therapy for patients with severe eosinophilic asthma. This is a clear evidence of a reduction in asthma exacerbation rates in patients with at least 2 exacerbations per year, and a statistically significant reduction in oral corticosteroid use, though as we saw, the average reduction was actually relatively modest. Other potential benefits or disadvantages, again, the trials were much too short to document any reduction in the long-term harms from chronic corticosteroid use, oral corticosteroid use, but that is a real potential benefit here. Disadvantage or an advantage is having to come into the physician's office every 4 weeks for these injections. This may partly explain the the decrease in exacerbations seen in the placebo group. They had more frequent contact, re-education about using their inhaled corticosteroids and their long-acting beta agonists, just more awareness of changes in their symptoms, and that may have caused some of the reduction observed in the placebo group. But it also is a burden to patients traveling, and that may decrease long-term adherence. Again, the trials were relatively short. This is also a new mechanism of action for treating severe asthma, and so that's a potential benefit that may enter into your consideration. We received a number of public comments. In particular, there was a concern that we had not highlighted the 75 milligram IV dosing of Mepolizumab sufficiently in considering the benefits and harms, and hopefully we've addressed that both in the write-up and in the presentation today. Ongoing open label trials with longer follow-up were also highlighted. Again, there's a 1-year and 3-year follow-up of the published data, of the published randomized trials that are, one has completed the 1-year data but has not been published. 3-year study is ongoing, so there will be additional data coming forward. There was also a concern that we do not highlight potential long-term benefits through changes in airway remodeling, which may result in less severe disease 5-10 years down the line. Again, this is a theoretical benefit, but really with a short follow-up, it's hard to evaluate that consideration. And finally, other groups wanted to highlight that there was a large placebo effect on exacerbation rates, suggesting that we could do a much better job optimizing current standard therapy, and maybe more effort should be attached to that before moving on to expensive biologic therapies. And with that, I will turn it over to Drs. Campbell and Whittington to present the economic analysis. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Melanie Whittington from the University of Colorado. As Jeff mentioned, I will be presenting the incremental cost per outcomes achieved. This analysis was led by Dr. John Campbell, assistant professor in the Department of Clinical Pharmacy at the University of Colorado. Financial support was provided to the University of Colorado from ICER, and we'd like to acknowledge especially Drs. Rick Chapman, Jeffrey Tice, and Dan Ollendorf for their assistance with this analysis. So this portion of the analysis is really concerned with what are the outcomes, costs, and cost effectiveness of Mepolizumab in addition to standard of care as compared to standard of care alone, whereas standard of care is that daily inhaled corticosteroid use along with additional controller therapy. To answer this research question, we used a Markov model, which is a really great analytical tool in economic space that allows you to extrapolate beyond our shorter-term time horizons as part of our randomized controlled trials and be able to look at these more downstream effects. The population we modeled included adults with severe uncontrolled asthma with evidence of eosinophilic inflammation. Now, the characteristics of our population are presented on the table of this slide, but it's important to note that our model is agnostic to most of these except for mean age and percent female, which play into our mortality risk alone. But I do think it's helpful in presenting them and how we're going to understand and use this model and interpret the results. This population is based off of the asthma exacerbation trial by Ortega and colleagues. We assumed a payer perspective, so we're primarily concerned here with direct medical care costs and drug costs, and used a lifetime time horizon. We did conduct a scenario analysis, which we'll present the results at the end, that varied this time horizon from 1 year to 50 years. So here's the structure of our Markov model. Our Markov model really has 3 primary transition states. Our non-exacerbation state, which is just our day-to-day symptoms, as well as the asthma exacerbation state, which is divided into 3 categories, including whether or not an exacerbation resulted in an oral steroid burst, an ED visit, or a hospitalization. And then our last main transition state is death, and that's separated here into asthma-related mortality and then other cause mortality. You'll see here that our model has 2 branches, our Mepolizumab and standard of care branch, and then our standard of care alone branch. And based on the evidence that we saw in randomized controlled trials, that Mepolizumab arm is going to have fewer exacerbations per year, a fewer proportion of the cohort that is on those oral corticosteroids at a potentially harmful level, and then a better quality of life. Now, as I mentioned, Markov models are great in that you can extrapolate beyond our trial time horizons, but we have to make assumptions in doing so. And the assumptions are outlined on this slide here. One is that we assumed that the treatment effect observed during the trials was consistent throughout the model time horizon. We also assumed an excess risk of death from exacerbation, only for exacerbations that resulted in hospitalization. An excess risk of death was not assigned to exacerbations that resulted in oral steroid burst or an ED visit, and this was based on literature by Watson and colleagues. We use a threshold of 5 milligrams of oral corticosteroid use a day as potentially harmful and associated with those adverse effects. Also, the exacerbation utility we assume to be the same across treatment strategies. And utility is really just this measure of quality of life on a scale from 0 to 1, with 0 representing death and 1 representing perfect health. So we said, okay, if you, whichever arm you're in, the Mepolizumab and standard of care arm, or the standard of care alone arm, your utility following an exacerbation is going to be the same. Conversely, the non-exacerbation utilities were different across the treatment strategies, and that was based on the St. George Respiratory Questionnaire data collected in the trials. We use the St. George Respiratory Questionnaire because there was an available mapping, so we can map that to the EQ5D, which is just the overall measure of quality of life. So the results, when we're comparing Mepolizumab and standard of care to standard of care alone, we see that the Mepolizumab arm was associated with a quality gain, or a quality-adjusted life year gain. It is worth noting that the majority of this quality gain of 1.53, the majority, 70%, is due to improved quality of life, and a smaller portion is due to actual life year gain. It was also associated with an increase in treatment costs. Treatment costs are going to be the costs associated with the drugs, and this increased more than $600,000 over that lifetime time horizon. However, our non-treatment costs were reduced in our Mepolizumab arm, non-treatment costs being the cost of the oral corticosteroid and the cost of the exacerbations. So we're comparing these incremental costs and incremental effects to each other. We calculated an incremental cost-effectiveness ratio. You'll see here presented as an ICER, of $385,546 per quality. And you can compare that to more commonly cited thresholds of around $50,000 to $150,000 per quality. Now, the results of these analyses that we use Markov models for are sensitive to the inputs that we select. And so it's important to assess how the variation in our inputs affects the robustness of the results and conclusions. And so to do this, we conducted a one-way sensitivity analysis, and the results are presented on this slide as a tornado diagram. And these tornado diagrams there's a lot presented in one slide, but our y-axis here, our vertical axis, is our base case ICER of that $385,000 per quality. And basically what we're doing here is for each parameter, we're just going to, instead of using maybe a midpoint, we're going to use our lower and upper bounds among its plausible range. And you can see those ranges on the left-hand side. And so those parameters at the top of this graph are going to be those with the most influence on our incremental cost-effectiveness ratio. And so you see here that with the most influence was utility improvement of Mepolizumab over standard of care alone. I do also think it's worth noting, though, that even with that range and ranging these parameters over its plausible range, there was no ICER that was calculated less than $315,000 per quality. It's also worth noting that the cost of the drug was not in that previous tornado diagram because that would have just largely predominated our diagram. Instead, we conducted a separate analysis for the cost of Mepolizumab, and the results of that are presented on this slide. The last row of this slide is our base case ICER of $385,000 per quality, with the price per vial being around $2,500, with the total price per year $32,500. Now, to get to an ICER of $50,000 per quality, the price per vial would need to decrease to $266, so about a 90% discount from the base case. Similarly, $100,000 per quality, the price per vial would need to be around $600, about a 76% discount from the base case. And $150,000 per quality would need a price per vial of $932, or about a 63% discount from the base case. So getting to an ICER of around $100,000 to $150,000 per quality would require a discount of the drug about 60 to 75%. Another scenario analysis we conducted was for the length of the time horizon. So here, in the base case, we assumed a lifetime time horizon. In the scenario analysis, we're going to assume 1 year to 50-year time horizon. And you can, as you can see here, the length of the time horizon doesn't drastically change our results. We see an ICER still of around $350,000 to $450,000 over time, and that's because the costs and the outcomes that we use in this model accrue constantly over time. Of course, it is important to keep in mind the model limitations when you're interpreting these results, primarily that the limited long-term follow-up data. And because of that, we assumed that the clinical outcomes and benefits that were observed in the trial were constant over time, and they may not be. Also, we really wanted to be able to expand this analysis from the payer perspective and look at more of the societal approach, and include cost to the patients and the fact that there could be productivity gains on the patient side. But the lack of absenteeism data prohibited us from doing that. Also, a responder scenario in comparison with omalizumab was not conducted. And again, this is due to data limitations. There were no head-to-head trials comparing mepolizumab to omalizumab or the single-arm evidence for us to make indirect comparisons. So unfortunately, we were unable to do that. Also, the wholesale acquisition cost of drugs, which we used as our cost of drugs, may not represent the true transaction price of drugs. So in conclusion, we believe that adding mepolizumab to standard of care for adult patients with severe eosinophilic asthma does appear to confer clinical benefits in terms of reduced rates of exacerbations and improved quality of life. However, the estimated cost effectiveness of mepolizumab exceeds our commonly cited thresholds. And to achieve levels of value more closely aligned with patient benefit would require discounts of about 2/3 to 3/4 from the current list price of mepolizumab. We are very grateful for the public comments we've received and have integrated them where possible. One comment was that omalizumab or Xolair was not modeled as a comparator, and again, we were just unable to do this due to the lack of evidence. Also, we heard that thresholds of $50,000 to $150,000 per quality may be too low when you're assessing a primarily employed population, which may be the case with the asthma population. And in fact, a higher threshold, maybe $260,000, may be more appropriate. And so we looked into this literature, and I think that's important to keep in mind. But again, the lowest calculated ICER we ever had in all of our sensitivity analyses was still $315,000 per quality. So it would be still above that higher threshold. More clarity was needed on how the trial data was extrapolated to assume lifetime clinical effects, and we've hopefully made that assumption more clear in this presentation and in our report. And again, the payer perspective doesn't account for the substantial out-of-pocket costs incurred by the patients on multiple medications, and again, we don't have the patient perspective costs in here. So keep that in mind when you're interpreting the results too, but we don't think that, even if we did, we don't think by including the patient perspective, the cost would drop below that $150,000 per quality mark. And I'll turn it over to Dan now.
Okay, with this head cold, in contrast to the clear speech you heard from Melanie and Jeff, you're going to probably call me the budget impact whisperer after this, but I will try to make myself as clear as possible. So I too have no conflicts of interest. I want to acknowledge Rick Chapman's efforts in this part of the analysis. Rick is actually across town giving another presentation now, so I am filling in for him, in fact. So as the panel knows, we've talked about this already this morning with our other topic. We first, to estimate the budget impact over a 5-year time horizon, we needed to understand the size of the possible population that would be candidates for treatment. We actually got a lot of positive feedback from the manufacturer of mepolizumab in terms of the potential target population for treatment. We vetted this against other sources, and we thought the estimates provided to us were quite reasonable. So what we were looking for was to estimate the number of patients who were age 12 and older who had severe asthma that was poorly controlled, defined again using that 2+ exacerbations per year, and eosinophilic inflammation. And so that population size is about 320,000 individuals in the U.S. As with the morning topic, we also assumed a 10% uptake here by year 5. So that's, on the ICER scale of things, that's a low uptake percentage, and this is for a couple of reasons. So first of all, this is an injectable drug that has to be injected in under the supervision of a physician, and so that might be a deterrent for some individuals. In addition, There is another anti-IL-5 therapy that's actually supposed to be decided on by the FDA in about a month's time, so that will potentially crowd the market to a certain extent. And we also heard from clinical experts that there are several other anti-cytokine therapies that are in various stages of development, and so by year 5, the market, in fact, might be quite crowded. So that led to our 10% assumption. So over 5 years then, we would assume that 32,000 of these 320,000 individuals would be treated with Mepolizumab. Our calculations, which have been made publicly available consistently for the work that we've done, are based on calculations that are looking at a target for overall healthcare cost growth that's tied to an increase in GDP plus 1%, the number of new drug approvals annually through the FDA, and the contribution of drug spending to overall healthcare spending. So through these calculations, we end up coming up with a budget impact threshold that we consider a policy trigger for discussion of managing the cost of new interventions. So when we talk about the 10% uptake assumption, we are assuming that is quote-unquote unmanaged. And that's a bit of a fiction, we recognize, because payers are interested in managing the cost of any new intervention. But what we hope to achieve with this policy threshold is to try to determine which interventions do need management. So we try to do this kind of in an unmanaged fashion. And so based on those calculations, our current estimates for the 2015-2016 year are $904 million per year in terms of a budget impact that would not trip this threshold for new drugs. So we actually received outputs from the model that John and Melanie worked on, providing us estimates of budget impact at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 years. And then we assumed that that 10% uptake was linear over time. So in each of those 5 years, 2% would initiate treatment with Mepolizumab. So on average, these budget impact estimates reflect 3 years of therapy, essentially. So 320,000 people eligible, 32,000 treated by year 5. The weighted budget impact per patient over that time period is about $93,000 based on the wholesale acquisition cost of the drug. And the average budget impact per year is about $600 million. So that's below our $904 million threshold. And in contrast to many other topics, we received no public comments on the budget impact analysis. So I think that's it. We can move on to Q&A.
So Q&A, I'd like to invite our clinical experts to come up to the table, please. We have Michael Peters and Christina Philpott. And I would ask each of them to declare any conflicts of interest, if they would, before we get started. Michael?
Need to find you guys can see, but I can't.
Is that me?
Yeah, I don't have any conflicts of interest to report outside of working in the NHLBI and receiving funding from the federal government to research asthma.
Thank you. Christina?
I have no disclosures.
Okay. So let's open to the panel. Any questions? Paul?
No, thank you. That was very comprehensive, and it was mentioned that there were some ongoing studies, and I did a quick look of clinicaltrials.gov. I saw there was one that supposedly was completed in 2015, a one-year follow-up, but and maybe that's the one one of those that we're talking about that is not yet reported. I guess my question is so does the FDA have they approved things on data that's not publicly available that potentially would, change our estimates? Is that, or is all the FDA data that they've seen been publicly reported? Do you know that?
I'm not 100% sure, and potentially the manufacturers could comment on that, but I think the FDA approved it based on the data from the 3 trials that I presented that all have been published in the publicly available literature.
Other questions? Christine.
I had a question about the financial analysis. When you looked at the differences, how, did you incorporate the fairly large placebo effect? And how did you incorporate that? In other words, were we looking at the difference in the treatment arm against their own baseline, or was the placebo effect subtracted out when you did that?
We did subtract out the placebo effect.
So this cost differential is between the people who received the placebo, how much they improved, and the people who received the drug, how much they improved?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
It's been a long time since I've been a house staff. What is the risk of death in this high-risk group?
I'll let Michael get that one.
It's probably pretty low, truthfully. Overall, death rates for asthma have deteriorated.
Deteriorated?
Yeah, well, depends on
Decline.
decline
Final transition.
over the last 15 to 20 years. So while hospitalizations are reasonably stable and the amount of patients that have severe asthma is stable, mortality from asthma has gone down in the United States.
I guess my follow-up question, I think you answered it, but let me dive a little deeper. Is this type of asthma becoming more common, or is it stable for, whatever the exogenous factors are that might cause it?
I think generally it's pretty stable.
If I could
I-
add
we
that
see that too,
asthma-related
analogy.
mortality used in the cost analysis was 0.4 per 100 person years, or 0.004, for the all-cause asthma-related mortality. And then we did assume an excess risk, additional risk of death of 2.48% for exacerbations that resulted in hospitalization. So still a very rare occurrence.
On the utility, can I do one more?
Go ahead.
Yeah, on the utility improvement, of which, that's the vast majority of the benefit that you're showing. How did you quantify, or how were you able to figure out the suffering associated with the stigmata of steroid use?
So in the randomized controlled trials, they did measure the St. George Respiratory Questionnaire utility, and there was an available mapping to the EQ5D, or overall quality of life. So that's what we used for that. For specifically the oral corticosteroids, there was a trial done. Let me check my source here.
That was the lupus study.
That was the cost of adverse events, was the lupus study. And then the disutility came from the NICE Mepolizumab manufacturer's base case. And we did assume that was equivalent to the DALIs averted. So there was existing literature on the disutility for the chronic oral steroid use. Did I answer your question?
I'd love to hear a clinical answer.
Yeah.
as well.
I think in practice, at least in our group, we use, and I think this is true probably across the United States, and that is the asthma control test is actually the more practical. It's a 5 quick questions in terms of that we give to asthma patients whenever they come in for visits. And, following that score over time, that's a different questionnaire. It's just more practical and it's easier. Some of the questionnaires that were used in in research studies are more extensive and more in depth, which in a research trial is definitely nice, valuable information to have. But in a practical sense, as clinicians, when we're following these asthma patients, obviously we want to look at their control profile every time they come in for a visit, and that's usually with asthma control tests, but then also asking them a series of questionnaires, looking at how much prednisone they're taking, if they're compliant with their controller meds, standard of therapy. And so there definitely is a subset of patients who have severe asthma with the eosinophilic phenotype who would benefit from better control, because, a lot of these patients just really do suffer from exacerbations. They're missing work, and their quality of life is definitely affected by the severity of their asthma.
But I guess in terms of the disutility of chronic oral corticosteroid use specifically, so as Melanie mentioned, this came from an analysis that attempted to estimate the level of disability in patients who are on chronic steroids and then convert that into a disutility.
I see.
Ralph, this is, again, sort of an economic question, and maybe I need to understand a little more granularity, or maybe I'm just naive. When we looked at you looked at the quality of life costs,
based on the cost of the drug, comes out about $32,000 per year. When you look at the weighted budgetary impact of the drug, it's $93,000 per patient. What is the difference of that $60,000? How much is that related to being in the physician's office? What are the things that are incorporated in that decision?
So the cost per quality gained was actually $385,000 per year. So I'm not sure where the $32,000 is coming from.
That was the cost.
Oh, the cost of the drug per year, okay.
So I'm wondering where that what the $60,000 budgetary
So the weighted
impact per
budget
patient.
impact is essentially, on average, over that 5-year time horizon, 3 years of treatment.
Got it.
So 32,000 or so times 3, that's where you get the
That's
93,000.
my naive question.
Joy?
I have a clinical question because I don't take care of very many people with really severe asthma like this. So it's actually sort of a two-part question. The first part is just about the prevalence of this severe eosinophilic asthma subtype. So the estimate in the analysis was about 70% of severe asthma patients are in that group. Does that resonate with your experience or your research background, or whichever?
I actually think we have no idea, to be
Okay.
honest with you. Because even the cutoff with the eosinophilia in the GSK trial was reasonably low. The 150 cells is pretty low comparative to, say, what's been done in some other trials. But we don't really know. We don't actually have great epidemiological trials in severe asthma that have been looking really at trying to identify molecular phenotypes of disease. So I think the 70% is a good guess. I think that's a reasonable place to say. But it's something that is really a guess. I think it really at best, and we don't have a great understanding of that.
And so then, just trying to make sure I understand this, there's also a biologic, it's Mepolizumab, am I saying that right?
That's right.
For the IgE subtype. And is there overlap between these subtypes? And so might there be some people that would benefit from both or one, or, I mean, how do you decide? And
Yeah, it gets even more complicated when you're looking in the future because there's going to be more biologics that are coming out. I think what this is a big paradigm shift in asthma treatment in general. But for the last 30 years now, we've been doing somewhat of a guideline-based therapy where it's a consistently step-up-based therapy. If you don't respond, you get more steroids, and that's pretty much been the guideline. You're not doing well, you get more of the same drug. And that has been relatively unsuccessful in regards to, as I said, severe asthma stayed about the same. Mortality has gone down very slightly, but it wasn't that high to begin with. And it has been ineffective. What we're now switching to is an understanding that actually asthma is a very heterogeneous disease, and that there are molecular pathways that are prevalent in some patients and not prevalent in other patients, and that if we can find identifying biomarkers and biologics, we could narrow the spectrum and specifically target that population. It's actually the dream of personalized medicine for a lot of fields, and we're getting there in some extent with asthma. But that has complexities to it, which is we have to meld this new system with what we've already been doing. And truthfully, we don't actually know how to do that. And so we've started to do it is actually in severe asthma because it makes the most sense.
And do we have good biomarkers at this point, do you think?
We're going to explore all of this and more in the roundtable discussion.
Okay.
I mean,
I
the
just-
biomarkers that have been presented in the research trials are the ones we should be talking about at the moment. And Chris, you'll be able to put your personalized medicine perspective on this too. But I'm going to suggest we keep to the
So
evidence
the only
presented.
biomarker really we're talking about here is eosinophilic, the absolute eosinophilic.
Rita?
Thanks. I'm intrigued by the dramatic placebo response and wondering if there's something there that we could be, because it was a fairly objective endpoint, right? Exacerbations, and clearly there was a 50% decrease. So, and Jeff suggested maybe it was more frequent visits. I mean, is there more potential to be looking for whatever that was going on in the placebo group to help us in asthma care?
Chris?
Yes, I think, and I'm sure Michael has mentioned this too, and that is there is a huge placebo effect in any of these kinds of trials, and particularly with asthma. And we do know with asthma, especially with severe asthma, that having more frequent follow-up, and these patients know they're being observed, they know they're being looked after, they know they're going to have their spirometry done at regular intervals, and they know they're going to be asked about their compliance with their controller meds and their long-acting beta agonists and, leukotriene modifiers and steroids. And so there's definitely, just by virtue of the fact that these patients are being regularly followed and managed, there's going to be improvement in those. And so with this kind of therapy, particularly, in terms of weighing risk, benefit, costs, I mean, it's definitely important in terms of selection criteria that patients have maximized, they have maximized their standard of care therapy, and they do meet the criteria for the eosinophilic phenotype, because those are the patients who are still having problems, they're not adequately controlled, and those are the patients who are going to benefit most from this drug.
Jed.
Thank you. Jeff, we all try to get our patients off of oral corticosteroid therapy. Do we know whether benefits accrue from simply lowering the dose? Do you have to get to a threshold lower dose, or do you have to get off to see the benefit?
I haven't looked at that literature extensively, so this is more my clinical gestalt, but I think lower is better no matter what. I can't quote data on that, but I think certainly all the way down to going off. So even people below, so the prednisone dose that's about equivalent to endogenous production of cortisol or equivalent is talked about around 5 milligrams per day. But clearly, we still have a hard time dropping from 5 to 4 to 3 in people on chronic steroids, and there are clear benefits to getting them off, even at that low level. So.
Yes.
I think I'd like to hear a little more about the role for what you call standard of care, because aside from the long and short-acting beta agonists and the inhaled steroids and oral steroids, the role for Singulair, the role for Xolair, where that fits into standard of care, and then how it fits in terms of switching or adding this new agent, because it seemed to me the standard of care being compared was not necessarily what you would say is optimized care, because there are other alternatives, unless I read this wrong, in terms of what they were considering standard of care absent this new medication. So I'm a little bit confused about the roles for those other agents and whether they really were optimized or should be before or in addition to adding.
Go ahead.
Yeah, your confusion is appropriate. Standard of care is, once it gets to the point where you're uncontrolled, it becomes the guidelines are basically try one additional agent, try another additional agent, try another additional agent. And so the standard of care is unclear once you get to the realm of severe asthma, truthfully. And the responsiveness is equally unclear, in that patients that seem to not respond to the drugs don't respond when you add additional agents that generally probably target the same pathological cascade, because that's where we've all been looking at. So it's a good question. Definitely they're getting prednisone or oral, and that has bad side effects. It's probably unlikely that Singulair or some of the other agents would be of significant benefit. Now, Xolair is a little different story, and the benefit of Xolair and Mepolizumab is unclear. And in fact, even the biomarkers, I know we didn't want to talk about it too much, but the biomarkers are also a little bit different in that Xolair was initially trialed with IgE as a biomarker, Mepolizumab with eosinophilia. There's some overlap between the two, and the best predictor actually in the Xolair trials for response to Xolair was actually a history of exacerbations. It's kind of independent of the actual biomarker of IgE levels. So the standard of care is just unknown. I mean, it's really, you don't know what the standard of care is. What we do know is that this is a biological cascade that's important, and hitting it seems to be effective. Teasing it out further is just, we don't have the answers really, I think, right now.
I would concur with that. I think, our standard of care, as we sort of loosely define it, we follow the NHLBI guidelines for step-up, step care. There's categories for defining what is mild asthma, severe asthma, moderate asthma, and we have, some definitions that, all these specialists in this area have agreed upon. And then in terms of, getting up to step 5 and adding, some of these biologic agents, where, and the populations for omalizumab consideration, I mean, there's a defined on-label criteria for that, and there are patients out there, and this has been true in published studies, that there's patients who fall outside that criteria who still benefit from omalizumab, and yet obviously we often can't get insurance to cover it if it's outside the on-label criteria, but I think that, another question is this drug going to be expensive as omalizumab, and is there a population who are on omalizumab that we would stop the omalizumab and switch them to mepolizumab and see if that population, is there a population of patients who are already on omalizumab and they've had some benefit but not complete benefit, and then maybe we would want to add on mepolizumab, which is, I don't know of anybody who's doing that, but that's kind of, that's a question that will come up as these things go forward. And, obviously these are expensive, and we want to make sure that we have some sort of clear guidelines in terms of therapeutic benefit. And then at what point do we say, this isn't working, and do we stop it? And that's another question too, because, we have a lot of experience now with omalizumab over the years, and while it is true that the selection criteria is fairly strict and most people do benefit from it, some don't. And with omalizumab, in our practice, it's, after 6 months of therapy, if there's been no discernible improvement in quality of life, reduced exacerbations, lung function, all the parameters that we look in terms of control, then we might stop it.
Right, so we'll explore that in much more depth during the roundtable discussion.
I'm sorry? Okay, I've just been reminded that we should move to public comments. We have two who have requested to speak to the group. First is Dr. Mark Forshag. Two things. Would you limit your comments to 5 minutes, and would you tell us your conflicts of interest, if any?
And you had a fact or two about the reduction in steroids. Feel free to add that in.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Forshag. I'm an adult pulmonologist, and I serve as GlaxoSmithKline's U.S. Medical Affairs lead for Mepolizumab, trade name Nucala. While the panel has extensive documentation regarding Mepolizumab, I wish to use the next 5 minutes to highlight what I believe to be three most relevant issues. One, the impact of severe asthma, particularly the eosinophilic phenotype. Two, the key findings of our clinical development program. And three, limitations of ICER's economic analysis of mepolizumab. As Dr. Tice had commented earlier, approximately 5 to 10% of asthmatics are classified as having severe disease, with most experiencing daily symptoms, frequent exacerbations, and reduced quality of life. Research utilization has been demonstrated to be higher in asthmatics as severity increases. And among severe asthmatics, the eosinophilic phenotype have more exacerbations and incur higher overall costs. Mepolizumab is a first-in-class monoclonal antibody designed to specifically bind to interleukin-5, neutralizing its ability to upregulate eosinophils, which cells are associated with a higher risk of exacerbations. The clinical development program for mepolizumab was extensive, lasting 12 years. There were 3 trials which directly supported FDA approval, followed by 2 open-label extension trials. The results of the late-phase trials provided data supporting the identification of a specific subpopulation likely to benefit from mepolizumab. And those 3 factors were severe asthma, defined as requiring high-dose inhaled corticosteroids, a second controller with or without oral corticosteroids. Secondly, a history of 2 or more significant exacerbations in the prior year or oral corticosteroid dependence. And third, a blood eosinophil count of 150 at initiation or 300 within the past year. This profile constitutes 3 to 5% of the general asthma population, or as mentioned earlier, 320,000 individuals in the United States. Using these enrichment criteria allowed mepolizumab to demonstrate the following efficacy results: a reduction in overall exacerbations of approximately 53% and of hospitalized exacerbations of 69% beyond that achieved with standard of care plus placebo. A significant increase in responders experiencing clinically important improvement in asthma control and quality of life. And I'll take this opportunity to respectfully disagree with Dr. Tice. The mean difference in St. George's questionnaire was 7 points, with 4 being the minimally clinically important difference, and 7 points is pretty robust. The odds of achieving that 4-point difference was 2.1 times in the treatment arm versus the placebo arm. And there was a significant reduction in oral corticosteroid maintenance dose. And I'll stop for a moment here to point out that the mean absolute dose reduction was not a pre-specified endpoint, and I suspect that the values shown earlier were based on a different population than the intention to treat population, which is the population we used for all the pre-specified endpoints. The rigorous nature of the trials and the positive results in a subpopulation failing all available standard of care led to the publication of the 2 confirmatory trials in the New England Journal of Medicine. 2 open-label extension trials have also been undertaken. And I'll mention that the reason that these are not placebo-controlled was that in a high morbidity population, it was felt to be ethically questionable to require placebo care out to as long as 2.5 to 3 years. The first open-label extension lasted an additional year beyond the phase 3 trials and is complete. This trial demonstrated durability of the exacerbation rate reduction, durability of the OCS dose reduction, and durability in the improvement of asthma control. The patients from the oral corticosteroid dose reduction trial who had been on placebo achieved a similar degree of oral corticosteroid dose reduction during the open-label extension study as the group that had been on MEPO all along. The incidence and range of adverse events is similar to that reported in the clinical trials program. In regard to the economic component of the draft report, we wish to note that there are differences between the model framework and final cost effectiveness and budget impact models. For example, neither model includes Mepolizumab, trade name Xolair, a standard of care comparator in the severe asthma space. In multiple analyses, we found that about 30% of Mepolizumab patients also met the criteria for Xolair. Xolair was not included in the budget impact model, in which it would have represented a 1-to-1 cost offset versus Mepolizumab in the overlap population. This exclusion results in a substantial overestimate of Mepolizumab's cost in the model. Secondly, the assumption that prednisone of less than 5 milligrams per day not being harmful is open to question based on some data that we have presented to ICER, and I will be happy later on to talk more about. And finally, the societal perspective regarding indirect costs, such as lost productivity, is not included and may be equally important to healthcare decision makers. Given this data, we feel that the questions before the panel can be answered as follows. For patients with severe asthma with an eosinophilic phenotype, evidence is indeed adequate to demonstrate the net health benefit of adding Mepolizumab to standard of care. The care value of adding Mepolizumab to standard of care is intermediate, and the provisional health system value of adding Mepolizumab to standard of care is high. In conclusion, we feel that Mepolizumab represents an efficacious and valuable therapy to a small, readily identifiable, and high morbidity population who currently lack alternatives.
Thank you, Dr. Forshag. Would you remain there for just a minute? We only have 2 speakers. Are there any questions of Dr. Forshag at this point? Hearing none, we'll go on to our next speaker, who is Brett Johnson. And would you also confine your remarks to 5 minutes and let us know your conflicts of interest, if any?
Yes, so I'm Brett Johnson. I'm a policy director at the California Life Sciences Association. My only conflict of interest is that we're a trade association representing more than 750 biotech, pharmaceutical device, and diagnostics companies, as well as research universities, institutes, investors, service providers, et cetera, et cetera. I'll keep my comments brief because I think the previous discussion and previous commenter said everything much better than I could have. So really, though our comments relate to, relate to this product, they're really more broadly applicable, and hopefully they can be a source of discussion at the round table. And a lot of these have already been touched on, but just I guess about 3 points. Our first point was just that we were concerned a little bit with the timing of this review. As was discussed earlier, there's another drug in this class that we expect to be approved at the end of this month, and we think this analysis really could have benefited from a class review or some more rigorous data that could have come from something like a class review and looking at class effects. So just going forward, I guess the perception for us was that this was kind of jumping on the first to market in this class, and I think looking at the other reviews for the rest of this year, there's a lot more class reviews. So we're happy to see that, but it would be nice to have a little more information into the thinking of the timing of some of these reviews. And then, just a little more information as to how, and I know Dr. Ohlendorf touched on a little bit, but a little more information on, how you may see the future development of this class of drugs kind of playing into some of the numbers that were discussed. Second point, and we were encouraged to hear the interest in going more towards societal value, and I think something like severe asthma, would definitely benefit from looking deeper into the societal value and the broader impacts, such as days off work. I have a colleague who has severe asthma, and it is frightening when she has an attack, and she'll be hospitalized and she'll be out of work for a week, sometimes 2 weeks. So, just to get an idea of lost productivity and things like that, we think would be really helpful moving forward, especially for conditions like this. Dealing with the public. We know that when the public, reads media reports and things like that related to ICER, when they see terms like cost effectiveness, I know that a lot of them do assume that cost effectiveness is taking into account societal value. So it would be great to see ICER and this body move in that direction and look more at that on the economic side. And then one quick final point was that we know that there was either some confusion or maybe miscommunication around the scoping document and the key elements of the review, and we would just ask that any deviations from scoping documents and things like that be promptly noticed and reflected in final scoping documents. So thank you for this opportunity and look forward to deliberations for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you stay up there for just a second in case there are any questions? I have one for our economists. Following on to your plea that we would acknowledge that this is a condition that affects people in their working years, if you were to take in lost productivity, is it possible that it might change the qualities to an extent that we might have a different view? Dan?
So we recognize that lost productivity is a major issue with severe asthma. One thing that's important to realize, though, is that what is of most importance in the modeling exercise that Melanie and John undertook is whether there's any difference between treatment approaches and the effect on productivity. We talked to the manufacturer about obtaining data on that. We never received any. And so we decided, we were a little dismayed because we recognize it's a major issue in this particular condition, but we couldn't include it in the model.
Yes, Marge.
So you referenced the importance of looking at social values in considering whether this is important. And I'm curious, given the recent studies, Kaiser Family Foundation, where 75% of the public believes that the cost of drugs needs to come down, and Medicare, for example, needs to control with it. How do you envision that social values may in fact be different than what has been shown through phone surveys about saying that costs are too high and we need to get a better control on the cost of drugs? Your comment suggested to me that you believe social values would indicate something different.
Well, if I'm understanding you correctly, I'm not sure I look at those as the same thing. When I was thinking societal value, I was thinking like, what was briefly alluded to in the revised report and in some of the slides, which was looking at things like, the benefits gained from, something like the targeted IL-5 treatments in terms of increases in productivity and how those aren't reflected. And I'm not sure that that is the same thing as the consumer's perspective of value.
So by social values, I mean, what additional benefit does this bring society in general, not necessarily what values do Americans have about the trade-offs between cost and benefit?
Correct. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's very helpful.
I'm not an economist, believe it or not.
Any other questions? Hearing none, I guess we go on to voting. Jed?
Right. For our panel, this is a touch of Groundhog Day, which I believe was a week or two ago, but we're going to go through it again. We understand the structure of our voting questions. Matt, do people have to re-register with the system, or do they still?
That's correct. Everyone will have to turn on their remotes once again and enter in your participant number that's on the back of your name placards, and then hit join.
So since you all learned this morning how to vote, and we've already had our Valentine's Day declarations, I think we can move right on to the substance.
I'm waiting for my diamonds.
Chocolate.
Oh, I chose diamonds.
And we have all 16 joined.
Matt, if we can go on. So I think the panel understands the format of our questions. Let's go right on to the question. Okay, so for mepolizumab, clinical effectiveness based on the data that Jeff has presented, and any questions or clarifications or additional comments you might have in the course of deciding how you're going to vote. The question reads, for patients with severe asthma and with an eosinophilic phenotype, is the evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of adding mepolizumab to standard of care, such as was defined in the clinical trials, and Jeff can remind us what that was, is greater than that of standard of care alone? Yes or no? So Jeff, in the light of some of the questions about what is standard of care, just remind us what the trials defined as standard of care.
Well, standard of care is essentially maximized inhaled corticosteroids and a long-acting beta agonist, plus or minus other therapies. For instance, in the trial looking at oral corticosteroid use, everybody was already on oral corticosteroids at some dose level. In the other trials, it was on the order of 25% or so of the patients were on oral corticosteroids, and then a smaller number of patients were also on leukotriene inhibitors and other drugs. Nobody was on Xolair in the trials.
It's an important point. And for panel members, look at your tables, the handy tables, to look at the reductions and exacerbations and other factors. Any questions? Rob?
I would say one.
Do you have a question, Rob?
I would just say one thing. One is that the mepolizumab trials did show a little bit greater reduction in exacerbations compared to the Xolair trials overall. So if you were taking those two populations as the same, mepolizumab was better. The caveat with that is the trial designs were slightly different with different biomarkers. So we can't be 100% sure whether or not it's the molecule versus the screening of patients that went into the trial. But there is a companion diagnostic with Mepo.
I would also add to that that, as was mentioned, that while there is some overlap between these two groups of patients that would be considered for omalizumab and mepolizumab, they're actually, the vast majority of them actually do fall, they wouldn't fall into the omalizumab group. They would be a separate group of separate phenotype for the potential treatment for that.
Thank you. So that's helpful in thinking about some of the economic questions that were raised. But in terms of the clinical evidence and clinical effectiveness, any other questions as you formulate your voting response for Jeff or our clinical experts? In that case, I'll ask you to register your votes, and we will see.
We're waiting on one more person to submit their vote. So if you still see the yes and no options, you'll just have to press the upper right key that says send. Oh, here we go. Let's see if I can fix it.
Just trying to display that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'll have to restart this again.
No matter how Matt tries, this never works.
Actually,
we'll get there.
There is a better way. There we go.
Okay. So we have a clear-cut signal, the feeling of the panel that clinical effectiveness has been demonstrated, superior to standard of care, which means that we clearly have to go on to the value questions. So if we can look at the mepolizumab care value, the question says, given the available evidence for patients with severe asthma and an eosinophilic phenotype, what is the care value of adding mepolizumab to standard of care versus standard of care alone? And this is your judgment of low, intermediate, or high, based on the series of considerations in the arrow below, both the comparative clinical effectiveness plus the incremental cost per outcomes achieved that Melanie presented, plus any additional benefits that you might have ascertained or gleaned from the discussion, and the contextual considerations, perhaps about the affected populations and even the societal benefit. And that would lead to your vote on low, intermediate, or high care value. So as you're going through your thinking, we would like you to share out loud what's in your head. So who would like to reveal the voices in their head? Chris.
I'll go first. So, like a few people have mentioned, the placebo effect is very intriguing. So the voice in my head that keeps saying, well, wait a minute, just try harder with standard care keeps popping up. And then the other concern, even though there is evidence that this is effective, it seems to have very high cost per quality. And tell me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but the fact that we set in the United States a reasonable cost per quality of around 100, 150, that's already taking into account that that's, you know, what someone would earn in a, you know, middle class, upper middle class work year. So I think that, is that an incorrect
Dan,
assumption
do you
that
wanna
that's how we're kind of taking into account missing work?
So basically the 50 to 150,000 per quali range that is not necessarily generally accepted in the U.S., but it's certainly used, is somewhere between 1 to 3 times GDP per capita. So yeah, there is a connection to the individual productive or production capacity.
I think one, and I am concerned about that the cost effectiveness thresholds and things that were done, even though they didn't specifically include indirect costs or costs to productivity, a lot of the utility assessment that goes into that, often the patients incorporate, when they think about my life, they incorporate that loss of work often. I think it's often does get included in these ratios, so I don't think it's been completely ignored by these numbers.
Oh, Steve.
I just want to add something also onto the, it's both a, you can't hear me?
No, good.
You can? Oh, there it is. The question about productivity as a part of the cost effectiveness ratio. In ICER's approach, we've built that in as one of the potential additional benefits for discussion. So we have a clear place for it to factor into the decision-making around care value. We do not, as a kind of basic approach, always try to capture worker productivity. This is still somewhat controversial at a kind of an international methodologic perspective, but one reason that it is not done by most countries is that if you do that, you end up indirectly favoring treatments for young working people, and that means that if you're over 65 and you happen to be on Social Security, you are in some ways disadvantaged in a cost per quality universe. So most of the national systems that use cost effectiveness do not, at least as a first pass, try to include worker productivity or taxes paid or other aspects of the true societal perspective in how they consider cost effectiveness for a health outcome.
Ralph.
You know, this is a very complex issue, and I think we may be interested in those doing the cost effectiveness analysis. Do we underestimate the quality of life assessment, the patient-reported outcomes in some of this? And then also related to loss of productivity is, you know, the 4 hours that we're spending once a month getting the shot, and how do you incorporate that into the equation also? Just a comment.
Well, why don't we ask if Melanie has a response to that, and then we'll go on to Rita's question.
As to there could be productivity losses in going into the facility to get the shot?
No, the impact on the patient's quality of life from that.
Patient-reported outcome and how you incorporate it.
Yeah, I think there was a portion in our report too, written by Jeff, I believe too, that going into the doctor, yes, there is the transportation costs and the productivity costs, but there could be improvements in health of that continued monitoring too. So I think it's something where there could be positive and negative trade-offs, and those may be hard to weigh.
Rita?
Well, great minds think alike, because I was also thinking of the the trade-off that you're losing. Patients don't like going to the doctor's office once a month and getting injections, and that's sort of a decrement or a disutility, and that's whether you're working or not working, you still suffer that disutility with the drug. So the other thing, Jeff, you talked a little bit about the quality of life data, but it looked like there was an improvement in quality of life in the placebo and in the treatment arm, and it was slightly greater, but not clinically significantly greater in the.
Yeah, there's lots of controversy over what constitutes a clinically significant improvement, and when you average it, of course, some people are getting, a proportion of the patients are getting what would be considered a clinically significant improvement and others are not, and you're averaging it together. So if your average is just around, and the average was the difference between the placebo and the active group, so there appeared to be a real quality of life improvement that was, depending on how you look at it, near or up just above what's considered clinically significant on average. But that means that, a proportion of patients are getting a very large improvement in quality of life.
Just one more question, but this is really for the clinical. Is there data on the reproducibility and variability of eosinophil counts? Because I can imagine they might change a lot, and how it, depending on your state.
Yeah. They do. There isn't great data on reproducibility. Hopefully we'll have some published soon, but we do know they fluctuate during the course of the day and day-night cycles. That was initially believed to be related to levels of cortisol in the body that fluctuate, and that would in turn change levels of eosinophilia. It's now believed that maybe that's even related to actually timing of eating, as opposed to so your fasting state at night, as opposed to the cortisol changes. And those numbers are reasonably significant, upwards of 50 to 100 cells, which is why if you're looking at a range of, say, 150, you're crossing over that threshold, and it's really it's unclear. And that's why I think GSK and some other groups have chosen this kind of arbitrary 150 at the initial, or maybe if you were ever eosinophilic in the past year threshold. So it's the reproducibility it's not great, but it's moderate.
Yeah, I would agree with Michael. The higher the eosinophil count at the initial therapy, the better people do with this drug. I mean, basically, the higher it is, the better they do. So the patients who were at the lower range, some of them still do well, but some of them don't have any discernible difference, and I think that's important. But can I ask a question of the economist?
Well, based on what you just said, I want to ask Jeff, if that
Okay.
analysis was presented in the trials, did they look at level of initial eosinophilia and response rate?
Yes, they did. Those data are presented, and yes, they very clearly showed greater responsiveness, greater response rates in those with higher. It's just their subgroups are pretty small again, so hard to place a whole lot of confidence in those results, but it makes biologic sense as well.
Okay, and then Dan had a question, and then Chris.
My question is sort of philosophical. It reminds me a little bit of the hepatitis C experience, where the standard of care was so abysmal. When the new antivirals came along, it was like, now we have a treatment and there is no other. It strikes me that our standard of care has been exceeded in this case. You've gone to the limit with it, and you only have one option. You have this new medication, and maybe overvalued, but it presents a problem when you're assessing value. We don't shrink from our categories, but maybe we try a little harder with our moral suasion to persuade people that yes, this is a very necessary drug because we don't have any alternative, but it's overpriced. So I just introduced that philosophical point about what are the options when you run out of options with your standard treatment.
Well, Dan, I'd say that voting on this question is a very good way to get to precisely the point you just mentioned. Chris, quick question.
I just had a quick cost question, and that is, given the fact that there are going to be more biologics, which, potentially are going to be, competing agents with this one, was that factored into the cost analysis? Because I know the long-term cost was based on, the current projected price point, but when these other biologics come out, just, we live in America, this is capitalism, is that going to drive the price down? Because there's going to be competition. Will that drive the price down?
That's a great question. It's anyone's guess. There has been no consistent trend across all therapeutic areas in any correlation between the increase in competitive products in any therapeutic area and a reduction in price. In some cases, it does happen to some extent. In other cases, it doesn't happen at all. Sometimes prices are tied very closely together for branded products, and they stay that way. They increase at the same rate, so it's very difficult to tell.
Thank you.
But the answer to your question is that the price was held the same through
Okay.
the analysis. Over here, we had a question. Marge.
Maybe this was brought up and I spaced out. Are there any socio-demographic characteristics associated with severe asthma, or is it pretty much across the general population? And I ask that as it pertains to the issue of people having to go in to the doctor for an injection once a month. And I think we know the studies show that people of lower socioeconomic, lower education also have lower compliance. And so I was just curious whether there would be an issue there. So the sociodemographics of people with severe asthma? Anybody?
I mean, there are clear socio-demographics. African Americans definitely have higher rates of severe asthma than the rest of the population. Inner city asthma rates, particularly in children, is lower. Excluded population, is higher. Excluded, obviously, in this study. It's a little bit unknown, just to overlay that on. The rates of severe asthma is higher. It's a little unknown whether or not they have more eosinophilic asthma versus non-eosinophilic, or type 2 asthma versus non-type 2, whether they'd be more responsive or less responsive in this population. It's not fully known at this point. So I think that's probably the best. And then age is also associated with severity as you get older.
Did somebody have a hand up down there? No.
Can I just add one more thing just on that point? Just I highlighted the very small numbers of adolescents and African Americans in the trial. There were subgroup analyses in the FDA documents that suggested that the benefits were about the same in those two groups. But again, the uncertainty around that is large. But they appeared to have similar efficacy in those two subgroups, just at least to address the African American disparity issue in severe asthma.
Michael.
Maybe asking this question too soon, but for Christina and Michael, is this basically a targeted therapy and you don't quite know the target yet?
Well, it is IL-5.
Let's hold that question.
Okay.
Because I think there's a lot more about our irrational exuberance for biomarkers, but we'll get into that. Kim?
Does anyone know if the risk of hypersensitivity reaction decreases with increased exposure? In other words, is it likely that with more experience of the drug, we won't have to come in every month to get it, and that we could do it as a nurse shot at home, or?
It's possible. And maybe Mark could address that one. But the allergic reaction rate so far with the data for Mepolizumab is actually much lower than with Omalizumab. And there was some placebo as well as patients who were receiving drug who had, observed reactions. So there is, always going to be a caution rate, but I think when we have more patients who are on it, see the long term, that may be a potential if we don't see an increased risk of hypersensitivity reactions. So.
And then do we have any idea of the overlap of patients who have both zoster and asthma?
Oh, I don't know the data on that. I know there have been, in my own personal experience, I do have a patient who's had zoster exacerbations who would be eligible for this drug that I'm holding off just until there's more data because I have concerns about that.
I just wanted to say, steroid use is a risk factor for zoster. So by definition, they're going to be higher risk than the general population.
So I call the panel's attention again to the question for which we will be voting. Given the available evidence for patients with severe asthma and an eosinophilic phenotype, what is the provisional, I'm sorry, we're on the, looking ahead. What is the care value of adding Mepolizumab to standard of care versus standard of care alone, low, intermediate, or high? So at this point in time, I think I will ask for the vote and you to record your thinking, and we'll go ahead. Question 2.
So we're not marching amongst that.
So we're equally split between low and intermediate, bringing the opportunity for us to share our thoughts about why we might have voted one or the other. I invite you to do so.
I thought it was low intermediate.
Low intermediate, thank you.
I put the check in between, but I had to take it.
And what went into your thinking?
It basically goes to the cost issue, and I think what I was hearing, and we haven't got to that discussion yet, is we have a heterogeneous disease, that we have a targeted agent. We're probably treating people that this isn't the right drug for them, so it could be a heck of a lot better, and the number could get a lot better if we figured out really the pathway or the target.
Right, and as Melanie said, a responder analysis wasn't done, and Chris indicated how you might do that differentiation, and that's what we want to get into in our next discussion. Other thoughts on why you voted low or intermediate?
It was too expensive.
It costs too much.
It cost too much.
Too expensive, cost too much.
For too few people.
Oh, it costs too much, but the benefit of reducing even 2 exacerbations can be pretty large, and I'd like to see more about the offsets around lost productivity, because just thinking about the time involved with an exacerbation, it really might offset that hassle of going into the doctor. So the cost is what it is, but I think there may be more benefit in terms of the clinical impact that partly hasn't been measured.
Bob?
Yeah, we keep kind of dancing around this little thing here, but clearly our experts actually just flatly stated standard of care kind of isn't. And we've obviously seen a noticeable placebo effect that everybody's terribly interested in here. So, you know, being a patient is the hardest job in the system. The second hardest job is being a caregiver for a patient. And trust me, a monthly office visit is not a good thing in most of those people's minds. But, you know, they also like to, most patients that I've ever had experience with like to leave the doctor's office feeling that it actually did them some good. And if we're clearly improving standard of care, just as a matter of course of business of doing this thing or injecting into the system, that's not a bad outcome.
Paul?
Yeah, no, I was persuaded by the modeling, and I think the numbers that came out suggested it's a very low value, while very effective.
An interesting
I gave it an intermediate. I thought the clinical effectiveness was superior, but I had problems with the 385,000 quality. And I'm bothered a bit by the unknown long-term risk of immune modulation regarding opportunistic infections. But I liked the oral corticosteroid dose reduction. So I wimped out and did intermediate.
Thanks, Rob. Jeff and then Kim.
So I gave it a low. You know, pricing is a choice, and $32,500. Yes, it's a small number of people, but the cost per quality is pretty low. Certainly, anything that reduces steroids is a good thing because they're pretty ugly. On the other hand, monthly visits to the doctor is kind of a hassle. So there's a lot of things on either side. I just think it's priced too high. If the price was down to something more reasonable at $12,000, for example, none of us would have a problem with it. And pricing is a choice. So if you choose to make $1 billion versus $400 million, I don't know about you, but $400 million still sounds like a lot of money to me.
Well, we won't vote on that, but next, Rob. Or Kim, rather, sorry.
I do think also that we are being influenced by a small trial, and I don't want to lose sight of the potential for zoster infections. So that's why I gave it
May I
low.
make a comment? Just on the monthly visits, I mean, an injection once a month, I mean, in the allergy clinics everywhere, we have patients on allergy shots, and literally there's millions of people, and they come in once a month, it's considered an injection visit, it's actually with the nurses. I mean, the doctor's nearby if there's a problem, if somebody has a reaction, but I think just in practice, what we've seen with allergy injections or Mepolizumab injections, which we've been using for many years, I think the patients are fairly self-selecting in terms of that, and usually most practices have available hours where it's not going to be horribly inconvenient for the patient to come, either before work or after work or, on their lunch hour, just to come in, get the injection, wait in the clinic 30 minutes, make sure there's no issues, and then leave. It gets pretty routine. So I think in terms of figuring that in from my perspective as a clinician who's seeing these patients, I think that portion of it isn't as cost heavy as, compared to the benefit that many of these patients feel with these therapies in terms of having to come in.
Thanks. Any other thoughts on low or intermediate value votes? Chris?
Yeah, given that there may not really be an overlap in the population who has this phenotype of asthma versus ones who are more environmentally driven from their poor living conditions or having to ride around on a bus all day or whatever, I don't know, so that's a question. But I think you could probably get as much of a quality of life improvement with a lot of the asthma patients I've seen over the years if you spent that $32,000 and bought them a car and got a better apartment. So that is kind of my take on that, is that this disease so disproportionately affects lower socioeconomic groups that I think we could look at that placebo effect and spend more money more effectively for more people.
So is that a covered health benefit?
No, unfortunately.
Alex?
Just a quick comment about the placebo effect. We're making a big deal out of it. I also just a word of caution that some of that may have been regression to the mean, and that there's natural variation in any symptom when you recruit a bunch of people who've been highly symptomatic with asthma over the last year. Just natural variation alone, there'll be some regression toward the mean. And we don't know what would have happened had we just followed those people without the office visits, et cetera.
I think, since it's been brought up, I'd like to just reiterate that point. We've seen the placebo effect in every trial that's been done in asthma to date. And there's clearly a very strong regression to the mean effect, and that the people who get better the most are the ones that were the worst in the beginning. And that just because there is a placebo effect does not mean they don't have severe disease. A lot of these patients are actually quite sick, and so they're dying for therapies, almost some of them literally, based upon the corticosteroids, so that they have a huge incentive to really feel better, particularly when they're coming in every 4 weeks and getting an injection. These are things that they just really want to get better, and so they do.
So any other comments on the care value? In that case, panel, hang in there. We have one more question. Question 3, the provisional health system value. Given the available evidence, what is the provisional health system value of adding mepolizumab to standard of care versus standard of care alone, low, intermediate, or high? And we're starting with our care value, factoring in the potential health system budget impact that Dan helped us understand, looking at the provisional health system value, the mechanisms to maximize health system value, some of which we've already touched on in terms of patient selection, stopping rules, things like that, to look at the goal of achieved health system value. And we have low, intermediate, or high, again, as our choices. Questions?
Jed, just a quick clarification.
Thank you.
So for your voting on provisional health system value, the reason it's provisional is because we do not ask you to try to factor in your judgment about what measures will be taken around coverage or guidelines or other things. This is thinking about the potential budget impact. And again, as this panel has experienced, this is usually a more significant issue when that trigger point that Dan talked about, the potential budget impact of $904 million is hit. So again, you can look at your care value vote, think about the potential health system budget impact, and then with that in mind, you can vote on provisional health system. And you do have this in your packets. There's that voting sheet, the multicolored one that can refresh your memory if you need to.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a touch jet lagged still. So we'll stop at that provisional health system value. That's what we're voting on. Paul?
Yeah, I don't know if you want to give any advice on if you rated the care value as low, could you ever say the health value was high, sort of like could you say the food was really bad, but at least the portions were large?
You've met my mother. In the way that ICER has conceptualized this, and we've, again, talked about it a little bit, but it's a great time for the question to come up. The anchor of provisional health system in the care value is extraordinarily strong. So in a sense, if the potential budget impact, unless it's a concern for the health system to try to manage aggressively, the provisional health system value really is what we view as the patient value, the care value. So there really shouldn't be much of a modulation here in the way that we have tried to conceptualize this as a tool for decision making.
Other questions and clarifications around this question? That did help. Other questions? Thinking?
Christine has a question.
Oh, Chris.
So even though the impact to the health system was under the 904 million, doesn't mean we'd have to spend that much on something that we say is a low value. Okay.
That is correct. Other questions?
I'm not sure it's a question or an observation, so I'm a little confused. We all, or many of us, bought at the idea of the 300 and something thousand per quality on an individual basis, but the increase is below this standard that we've determined is acceptable for society, which takes into account other features, like how many people are going to get it.
Yes, and how many other innovations are entering?
So the statement, I don't know whether Steve made it, that if you're low value on that end, you would have to be low value for the provisional health system value. No, is that not true?
Steve referred to it as an anchor, but he can explicate.
Okay.
It is fairly true, because what we're saying is that no matter how many patients we treat, if your judgment was that it's low value, then it should be a low value for the healthcare system to bring it in. Now, you could make a theoretical argument that if the budget impact were so small that it would somehow not displace, anything else. It's still hard to imagine why it's low value for patients but higher value for the health system. It's not saving money. It's still going to either displace other care or do other things. So, again, our view of the provisional health system value is that it should take into consideration the care value for patients and whether there is a kind of a sign of it triggering the need for more aggressive policy considerations around how to manage its introduction to assure that we retain the value that we have at the patient level for the health system.
Right. Again, the perspective of short-term budget considerations applies here.
Right.
Joy?
The other thing that makes me a little uneasy about making these choices is the level of uncertainty around all of this. I mean, we're really talking about evidence from trials of about 1,000 patients, none of which lasted longer than all of which were less than a year in duration. So, and then there's a very uncertain marketplace that this is sort of entering into. So when you add all that uncertainty together, I feel like it's just a very wide confidence interval about how much this particular drug is going to contribute to better care for asthmatics, and whether or not in a few years we're going to say, oh my God, we didn't realize it had these terrible side effects. There are a lot of factors that we just don't know. It may not. It may turn out to be a very good drug for this small subset of people that are very ill, but I just feel very uncertain, I guess.
Did you want to comment?
Well, I would just say I think uncertainty continues to percolate through the decisions and the judgments. That's why there are more than one of you, and you all have different perspectives. What you just expressed, I hope you wove that into your judgment about care value. So that's obviously what you just described sounded like considerations around the care value a little bit less than the provisional health system value as a separate consideration.
And you will notice there is no opportunity to abstain, so we would ask you to make a judgment and vote. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts around this question 3? Matt, have we all voted?
We're still waiting on 3 more votes, so you may have selected the option, but just make sure to hit send with the upper right key. And there we are at 16.
So 12 for low value and 4 for intermediate value at the health system perspective. Panel, you have done your job. Thank you very much.
Jed, ask somebody why they changed their vote.
You heard the man. Somebody altered their votes compared to the care value. Why would someone have altered their votes if you don't want to take personal accountability?
Well, I don't know that I think my vote was discordant, right. So I think, I was thinking about the individuals who would benefit from the steroid reduction and the reduced exacerbation in light of the cost, so I gave it an intermediate for the care value. But for the system value, I think that the total budget impact, I could not justify for the number of patients. So I think the voting question is designed to exactly separate, those opinions.
Thank you.
I agree, and far be it for me to imply there's bias in the analysis, but if anything, we're understating the economic impact of these because the quality versus the number of new drugs coming out seems to me to be going up each year. Am I interpreting incorrectly, Dan?
Dan, you want to mention?
The number of new drugs each year is escalating, and you're basing the analysis on the number that came out the prior year.
You're talking about what we divide
The total,
through
the
in terms of
aggregate
number of
cost
new
for the
drugs.
system.
Yes,
for
that's
new
based on a
drug.
2-year rolling average. I'm not sure what our next estimate will be, but it has been,
Right.
it has been trending up over time, yes.
Right. So if anything, we're underestimating the total cost to the system for a new drug if in fact next year more drugs show up.
Yes.
And we approve them all.
Any other comments? So we could spend the money on apartments and cars, or we could spend the money on other healthcare interventions, and the question is whether we should spend the money on this particular healthcare intervention. I think that's the summary. Well, with that, we've concluded our voting, and we get to finally talk about all these other interesting questions around personalized medicine and delivery system design. And for that, we'll also invite up Tanya Winders, I'll let you introduce yourself. She's our patient representative and advocate for people with asthma.
Thank you. My name is Tanya Winders, and I am the president and CEO of Allergy and Asthma Network, the nation's largest nonprofit for families with asthma and allergy. We currently have over 2 million members across the country, and I'm happy to represent the voice of the patient here today.
Well, thank you very much. We did hear some patient perspective for diabetes, whether as a caregiver, as an individual. So we haven't heard that yet for asthma. Share a little bit about your family's experience with asthma, the burden of the disease, the impact on your lives, as well as the burden of treatment and how it might change looking forward.
Sure. Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity. I do have a unique perspective on this because I've spent 20 years of my life dedicated to this space of asthma, personally and professionally. I'm the mother of 5, 4 of whom have allergies and asthma, and all teenagers and preteens at this point. So, yes, shake your head, yes, 5. Ages 11 to 17. And then professionally, I've led Allergy and Asthma Network for the last 3 years, but have spent 16 years of my career in this space of allergy and asthma, in diagnostics as well as in pharmaceuticals. So I think that, again, in our interactions with patients each and every day, we field thousands and thousands of calls with families each and every year. And certainly the burden and the impact in this particular area of severe asthma is significant and really shouldn't be understated. I think that, again, sometimes it is a matter, are we asking the right questions? And when we talk to patients, we just conducted a survey of over 2,500 patients who really what we found is that when objectively asked about limitations to activities, use of albuterol, overuse of albuterol, disruptive sleep, that the number is actually significantly higher than this 5 to 10% that's been stated here today. And so I think that, again, it's asking the right questions and getting the right replies to truly assess the impact and the burden on the individual as well as on society as a whole. So again, I respectfully, I would say that has been understated here thus far, in my opinion.
And the impact of cost of these new agents, are patients clamoring for this drug? We heard, for CTAF groupies will remember that in some of our other topics, the patient networks were abuzz with anticipation before migraine treatments came to market. Are people talking about Mepolizumab?
I think people are excited about the introduction of new biologics in the space. I think that these new products certainly have provided hope for those that have been somewhat frustrated in their current care plan. I would also say that they are cautiously optimistic because, again, asthma is very much a heterogeneous disease. And we're learning more and more about that as we spoke about the phenotypes here today. So certainly I think that thinking asthma is erroneous. And we need to really begin to better understand the disease in order to target the treatments.
And Matt reminded me, Tanya, that you filled out your conflict of interest survey. Just share with us.
Yes, so I don't have any relevant conflicts of interest. GSK does support Allergy and Asthma Network and our Day on Capitol Hill each year.
Thank you very much. Well, should we ask our health plan colleagues, is this shades of Xolair, or are you going to deal with this differently? How is this going to play out?
Okay. Well, first of all, with this particular agent, we did put it on the formulary. It's under our medical benefit, and I can go over the deliberative process there. But one of the things that we noted is utilization has not been great at this point in time. So in terms of economic modeling of this particular agent, we haven't really pursued that aggressively right now. I believe this data reflects since the medication came out, we've had 8 requests. And I can't this time. This time, I can talk to approval and denial rates. The denial rates for that were 6 of the 8 were actually denied, and the reason for the denial was not a judgment of the severity of the condition or anything more arbitrary. It was that the medication, for instance, was used with Xolair, which has not been studied, which has not been tested. And one denial in particular that I'm aware of, the eosinophil count was never achieved, was never gathered. I think as the deliberative process took place for us, we were impressed with the strength of clinical evidence, and again, that did influence our formulary decision to put this on the formulary.
So one thing, again, Neil Kohatsu, Medical Director at Department of Healthcare Services, which oversees Medi-Cal, and I didn't mention this morning, but I have no industry or other relevant, there are no conflicts of interest. Xolair, what I didn't mention was that all FDA approved drugs for Medicaid have to be available on the fee-for-service side, which I did talk about this morning. Plans do have discretion, though, in terms of prior authorization and have to cover drugs within a class, but not necessarily every medication. So I talked with our fee-for-service pharmacists. There have been very few requests for Xolair and less than $1 million for all the fee-for-service population in terms of spending. I don't know, I can't speak for the 22 health plans, but I would say that the discussion on high-risk populations, obviously the Medi-Cal population is not the same as the CalPERS or the employed population. We have a larger African American, obviously by definition, lower income population, higher environmental risks. And so those are at least some of the things that I think will have to be factored in as the health plans, the 22 health plans look at their, how they're going to handle these new class of biologics.
So it seems like some intrepid clinicians are already exploring off-label use in the sense that they're not following the labeled indications. I would ask our clinical experts and Tanya, as an asthma advocate, their thoughts.
I would say for most of my colleagues in allergy and immunology, and then also my pulmonary colleagues in our group, we all have a subset of severe asthma patients whom we follow that, we can probably count them on one hand or one finger in some cases, and that is, who have severe asthma, who failed all the therapy that we're taking, trying to, maximize their control of their asthma, and who have an eosinophilia, and who we've been keeping in mind when this drug was approved that this is a patient we're going to bring in and see if they, match the criteria and, reassess them and do that. But at the same time, being aware of potential side effects, that are now, we have concerns about with, even with the zoster risk or, potentially, other long-term consequences of this. But I don't think there's that many patients. I don't think it's as many patients as people think. I think as clinicians, at least the ones who I've talked to about this medication, and that is there is going to be a select few who are really going to benefit from this drug, and we hope it is covered for them.
So you're saying a small number of patients who are already on labeled indications.
Correct. I don't think it's going to be the patients on Xolair, by and large, because if a patient's still on Xolair, that means it's working. And so if they tried Xolair and it didn't work, we took them off of it. And so I don't think there's going to be a lot of, there's not going to be a lot of duplication in the clinical practice, at least from my perspective.
Okay. Did you want to make one question? Comment?
One of the concerns that we have is whether or not the use of this particular agent will generalize to, COPD, for instance, Churg-Strauss, those types of disease processes. My understanding is that that's being studied at this point in time, but again, my impression on that is that off-label use per se probably is not going to be predominant.
Okay, is there a labeled indication for Churg-Strauss? I'll just ask. There is not. Okay, just to clarify that. Tanya, how do skilled, expert, engaged patients understand on-label, off-label use, mixing all these new drugs?
Well, I think it is somewhat, depends on the individual patient. When you've seen one patient, you've seen one patient. And I agree that I think, at least in our dialogue with most of the clinicians that are experts that are part of our network, which we have over 100,000 healthcare professionals in our network as well, they are very clear to say this is a very targeted therapy. And I think that some of the discussion here around the biomarkers, the need for better tools and companion diagnostics, and certainly tailoring that treatment to a personalized medicine approach is going to be critically important as we gain that better understanding that all severe asthma isn't the same.
Now, Michael, you participate in the Severe Asthma Research Network and as such are doing trials on these patients, but you also have an academic referral clinical practice. What do you think about the number of patients that are ready to go on this drug and whether there are expanded indications that you might investigate?
Yeah, I think I think the heterogeneity of asthma in some level is extremely complex and can't be understated. And so in some world, we've done maybe ourselves a disservice in the asthma community by labeling all patients as just having asthma because the perception in the public is that it's the same disease. In regards to the specific question in regards to, there are definitely subpopulations that we all have that we think are going to definitely benefit from the drug, or we think will benefit clinically. The eosinophilic, persistently exacerbating subject who's on high doses of corticosteroids is pretty clear. It seems like they will get a benefit. Off-label use is going to be a problem, I think, as is the case for many medications, and that it probably is a narrow, specific, targeted population that will benefit. Churg-Strauss, in particular, seems to be a population that seems to probably likely benefit from this drug as well, and And so it's reasonable to think biologically that they would get benefit. COPD, probably not as much. I think the biology there is less likely to be beneficial, and it's clearly in a much smaller population.
That answered the question. Panelists, are you percolating? While you percolate, I have, reading this report, recovered some very unpleasant memories from training of obtaining and smearing sputum on slides and staining it for eosinophils. Does anybody do that anymore? Is that actually correlated well with the blood eosinophil count? I mean, isn't it the target organ involvement that's of interest?
That's a great question. So we do not do that in the States, mainly because it's extremely difficult to pull off. I will say there is one clinical trial that is currently going on that is doing that exact thing, that's using blood eosinophils as a directed, targeted therapy, not in severe asthma, but in mild, moderate asthma, to see whether the response to
Blood?
inhaled... No, sputum.
Sputum, yeah.
Sputum eosinophils.
Mm-hmm.
The correlation between blood and sputum eosinophilia is pretty good, actually, surprisingly good, based upon some data actually that we've published. So it's pretty good. But it's probably not perfect, and it's really unclear exactly what you're measuring with this sputum eosinophilia and the percentages, because they're pretty rare cell populations.
Clinically used in your practice?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
It's used in Canada.
I wish I had trained now.
Yeah. I will say it's used in Canada. The Canadians have been pushing more of sputum eosinophilia to be used in practice.
Okay, Steve, did you have your hand up? Or?
I did.
Go right ahead.
Okay. Sometimes we ask questions about potential prior authorization provisions for coverage, given that, as you point out, there's sometimes a tension, not just between label and off-label, but sometimes even within the label. So I just wanted to pose some questions, I guess, primarily for the insurers. The trials included, the biggest one was the one that required for entry 2 or more asthma exacerbations in the past year. But that's not actually part of the FDA label. So in your prior authorization, do you think it's reasonable to consider requiring documentation of failure by having asthma exacerbations, either requiring an ER visit or some other kind of trigger that would show you that this patient is not adequately controlled on best usual care? And I guess a linked question is, and it gets back to I actually wouldn't call it a placebo response necessarily, but is there going to be some requirement to document best usual care and a failure of that in order to obtain kind of coverage for this drug?
Tony, are you going to make Rena fill out more forms? How are you going to ascertain this?
I'm sorry.
And I would encourage you to think generally. It doesn't have to be just about your insurance company, but
Right.
thinking broadly about the country. Is this a reasonable approach to take when the panel has voted that it's low or intermediate value? Is it reasonable to consider relatively tight prior authorization, and how do you think they might go about that?
First of all, I can review with you what our prior authorization criteria actually are. Certainly, the prescription by a pulmonologist or an allergist was required, and that the patient's 12 years of age, the eosinophil count greater than 150 cells per microliter within 6 weeks, last 6 weeks, or 300 within the last 12 months, and that's fairly standard. We do require documentation that the patient has an inadequate response to a high-dose inhaled corticosteroid in combination with a long-acting beta agonist and has been compliant with therapy for at least 3 months. Difficult to obtain from a clinician, and we apologize, but again, we felt that was fairly important to document. And that one of the following has to be registered within the past year: 1 or more acute asthma-related ED visits, and let's see, or 1 or more acute inpatient visits where asthma was the principal diagnosis, or 2 or more acute asthma exacerbations requiring oral systemic steroids. We also require that the patient's not a current smoker, and again, we mentioned this before, that the agent will not be used in combination with Xolair. This reflects, I did not write these, but this does reflect the essential approach that we had with Mepolizumab in terms of criteria that because of the expense of the agent, because of the increased intensity of service that this requires, that we assure that there is documentation that there is significant asthma-related morbidity.
Thank
Yes.
you. Let me just ask Neil to respond, and then I want to ask our clinician and asthma advocate how those criteria sound.
So we don't have, they're not, for the fee-for-service population, Medi-Cal, because I checked with our chief pharmacist, there aren't written criteria as there are for Blue Shield. It's discussion with a clinical pharmacist. I'm sure they would go over the same types of issues. We wouldn't feel restricted at all to what the FDA sets as kind of the guidance, but as with hepatitis C, go to clinical guidelines and the research as was presented here. So, as I said, I can't speak for the 22 health plans. One comment I wanted to bring up, we talked about that $150,000 threshold. I don't know if we've talked about other countries. Some have a lower threshold, some maybe, I don't know if anyone has a higher, but certainly some have a lower. One of the things as a payer, insurer, especially as a public payer, we are trying to work actually with both the Covered California and CalPERS to say, can we make room in the overall system and not just talk about new medications, but what can we reduce the overutilization of inappropriate care? So what if it were $225,000? Is that, you know, I'm a little concerned. In fact, $150,000 per quality wasn't even, that threshold is kind of moved up. So I think we're trying to take a more of a global view and say, let's look at what our existing services are. IOM still says 30% wasted the system. So I like this discussion of saying, can we focus in on a population that benefits and create room so it's not a numerical cutoff, because then there wouldn't need to be a panel discussion.
Okay, there's going to be a lot of responses to that, but before we lose what the authorization criteria were, as Tony's described them, say those were generic insurance criteria. How do those sound to you, most involved with patients and care?
I think it sounds reasonable. But I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the patients who are going to benefit from this are going to be the patients who have clear-cut, have an eosinophilic phenotype, and have severe asthma, and those seem like reasonable criteria in terms of, I mean, as long as it's in terms of it's an or situation, not an and situation. I mean, except for the eosinophil criteria, but for the, you know, in terms of qualifying someone as severe asthma, it'd be 2 exacerbations within the last year, or chronic prednisone use, or not, in other words, not all of the above. So that way the clinician can make the individual decision, you know, risk benefit for a particular patient, you know, clinical judgment, and then decide to make that choice. I think that's a reasonable criteria.
Thank you. Tanya, Michael?
I think it did sound certainly very reasonable from the perspective of a patient advocate. I think also the discussion earlier this afternoon in regard to just enhancement of standard of care and a greater understanding and consistency of standard of care is needed in the space. I think that, again, when we look at standard of care, we think about the treatments of combination therapy in asthma, and yet there are so many other things, such as patient education, self-management, home assessment and environmental control measures. There are so many other things that we need to consider before necessarily getting to this as an option.
Okay. Anything to add, Michael? Or
No, I think that I'd agree. That I think those requirements seem reasonable.
Okay, now we have a hub of interest and questions over here. I think starting with Marge,
Yeah,
then
I just had a
Dan?
quick factual question for Neil. So you had said.
Marge, can you use your microphone?
Sorry. So you had said earlier that Medi-Cal patients who are on fee-for-service are entitled to any drugs that have been approved, FDA approved. So this has been FDA approved, and yet you also described criteria that must be met before Medi-Cal will authorize this drug. So Is that a conflict, or you still have that wiggle room to say no?
They can, any Medicaid program can implement reasonable, and that sometimes is deliberated in the courts or determined in the courts what's reasonable. Those criteria, what I meant was that they actually aren't written criteria for, except with hepatitis C, there are very few exceptions. Most of the time in the fee-for-service program, when there's prior auth, clinician or someone representing a clinician would talk to the pharmacy, a clinical pharmacist who is skilled in that utilization review process. And they would use what I was mentioning, criteria that would be, I feel, similar to what Blue Shield has described. They do try, obviously, for equity and consistency, use criteria, but they're not published criteria that are in a policy book.
Thank you.
Dan.
We're already talking about ways to restrict the use of this drug. We've voted that we have a drug that is effective in a subset of patients for whom there is very little alternative. So it gets back to the elephant in the room about price. And maybe this is a question for the manufacturers, and they don't like to talk about this, but is this category of drug, the biologicals, for some reason very expensive to develop? I mean, how do you reach that price point? I mean, that's the only problem here. If it weren't priced where it is, we would want to use this in those patients. So how does one arrive at this price in this category of drugs?
Are you allowed to even speak to this?
To a general degree, yes.
Okay. We don't want to get you in trouble.
So when we price the product, I would say the cost of manufacturing it is the very, very bottom end. And biologics are more expensive to manufacture than small molecules. Past that point, we look at the value to the patient and to the healthcare system. And we do take into account benchmarks. In this case, Mepolizumab is not a one-to-one comparator, but since it's the only biologic in the asthma space, it was the benchmark we had. But after we look at those values, look at the benchmark, we set a price accordingly.
Thank you. A fair answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
There was another question over here. Was it Joy and then Chris?
This is just coming from as my role as a family physician, where I fill out those prior auth forms all the time. The one thing I didn't hear that I can imagine might be a reason to use this medication, which I'm not overly enthusiastic about anyway, is somebody who's chronically dependent on oral steroids to control their asthma, and maybe the oral steroids are actually doing it for them and they haven't had an exacerbation in the last year, but nonetheless they're still subject to all the side effects of those oral steroids, and all of us would like to get people off of them. So that's one that I didn't think would fit your criteria. No, it was two
Actually, in the criteria that we did mention, one of the requirements is that we have reasonable assurance, by documentation usually, that the patient has had an inadequate response to a high-dose inhaled corticosteroid and a long-acting beta agonist. In terms of long-term oral steroid use, I don't believe that was mentioned in the deliberation.
Consider that as meeting criteria, because without it, you would have multiple exacerbations.
So, Tony's clinical pharmacist.
I'll remember that. Not that I'd be ordering it.
Well, I think Chris was next.
Yeah, I just want to go back to this question of standard of care, which is pretty, if you go out into the real world and see who's getting that, it's pretty abysmal. So the California Integrated Healthcare Association runs a pay-for-performance program, and there is an asthma measure. So this is for the commercial population. And then those results are published and available on the Office of the Patient Advocate website. And I'm just looking at the LA County numbers, and setting aside Kaiser, which is a very supremely integrated organization, it doesn't reflect the rest of medical care very well. The very best group hits 82%, and that is a ratio of, the appropriate ratio of controller medication to rescue medication, and most of them are in the 70s. So what this really, and this is in LA County, but it's similar elsewhere, PPOs, all the health plans are rated fair to poor. So what this means is that most patients are not getting standard of care. And I think as was seen by the Blue Shield experience, doctors are writing prescriptions for the next thing that they saw or that they were detailed about, and not really getting back to basics. And so that's always a concern with any of these medications is indication creep. That, people are going to start putting people on medications that are expensive, potentially harmful, because we're probably going to see other downstream infection concerns, just as we have with other biologic medications. And so, I think
Well,
that's a
fortunately,
real issue.
not too many people have jumped that gun, but you're right, it is the concern. Go ahead, Christina, and then Michael, in terms of appropriate treatment, and Tanya, you mentioned the overuse of albuterol, which is not only inappropriate but dangerous. So let's hear.
First, I did want to say that we have not seen an increased infection rate with Mepolizumab, and that is a biologic, and that's been in long-term use for treatment of asthma. I think with this particular medication, there is the warning about, making sure you check for parasitic infections before, and then we still need to see some more data on the zoster thing. But I think, in general, the cost point, I did have a question about your data that you mentioned. Is that in terms of doctor prescribing data, or is that patient actual fill data at the pharmacy?
It's claims.
So
based on claims.
So it's fill data. Okay.
Okay, Mark, did you have a fact to bring into the discussion?
Just a really quick comment. We share your concern about good standard of care, and one of our biggest concerns is that people will use this instead of good standard of care rather than add it to good standard of care, and they won't see the results we saw in the clinical trials and become disappointed. Toward that end, we have a field force of 19 certified asthma nurse educators whose job it is to train the trainer within doctors' offices on the appropriate use of all their asthma medicines.
Thank you. Good to hear.
Yeah, and I'd just like to, in regards also to that standard of care, I think there are definitely patients, there's no doubt, that don't receive standard of care. With that said, for example, in the severe asthma research program, the definition of severe asthma is standard of care, high-dose inhaled corticosteroids and beta agonists. And of the subjects we recruited, about 60 to 70% of them had an asthma exacerbation in the last year. So that means that there is a large subgroup of patients that are receiving standard of care and still need additional medications. That does not mean that there aren't patients out there that don't receiving, but there is a sizable and significant subgroup that does.
Any additional comment, Tanya?
I would just ask for the
To the mic.
definition of standard of care. Sorry, the definition of standard of care being treatment or the comprehensive asthma management that's outlined in NHLBI.
Sounds good. Meg, you had a question, then Ralph.
Well, it was really more of a mechanistic one around how you, with the prior auth process, what you require to document that the patient has had standard of care. It's just sort of getting to the point of, like, when filling out the forms, how difficult is that for physicians, or, appropriately wanting to make sure that it's not just the docs are checking boxes and in fact they really aren't providing that treatment if they're saying they are, but how much are you requiring them to really prove that in some fashion?
Thank you. My understanding, and again, I'm going to defer to Vicki on this as well, as far as her actual experience with this, but generally speaking, the clinical pharmacist will look at the quality of clinical notes that are provided with the request, and look to see whether or not the various elements are there. Vicki?
Could I say something too?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say too that the data that you cited too, that's just all practitioners in primary care or anybody, or was that specialists?
That's all. So it's the population of patients for that health plan that fit the criteria for asthma, which is usually either 4 visits over 2 years, 1 ED visit, 1 inpatient visit with asthma, or 4 fills, I believe it is. And then it looks at the ratio of controllers to rescues that patient has claims for.
Okay.
So,
Just
and
again,
that's all comers
okay.
within the population
Just
of
to
the
make
health
a plug
plan or the
for
medical group.
for specialists, I guess maybe I am.
Specialists
obviously.
are by
Well,
definition
and
special.
that's- yeah,
So,
I'll just clarify briefly our operational process for reviewing. We are unique in that we have our pharmacy benefit as well as our medical benefit with pharmacists to authorize on both sides, and we have access to each other's data. So in the event that boxes are checked on a form for long-term inhaled corticosteroids, we can check your claims in the outpatient setting. We can also check on the other side if you're on what you're on in the medical setting. And we also do encourage chart notes to be submitted with the form. And as you probably all know, that in California now we have a single-page prior authorization form that is legislated and required. So you all of the questions are generic and the same. So again, we do encourage lots of notes.
Ralph.
This is actually a clinical question for our asthma experts. If you had patients who you were concerned who were on long-term oral corticosteroids for management, and you were trying to think of whether this drug would be suitable, would there be a bunch of patients who eosinophilia would be low because of the oral steroids, and you would therefore miss opportunities? You may not have a asthma eosinophil count in the last 6 months that would meet criteria. Comments on that?
I mean, it's possible. I think you'd probably get some debate as to whether or not that would be concerning or not concerning. I mean, if you don't have eosinophilia, the thinking would be because IL-5 is actually a very specifically targeted cytokine, that really the receptor is generally only on eosinophils, and that if you don't have them, even if you're on oral corticosteroids, you maybe wouldn't benefit from the drug anyway. Now, if you took them off the oral corticosteroids and their eosinophilia went up, then you would be replacing it. There'd be like a replacement, and there might be benefit there. But I think that would be the general consensus, but I think there's probably some wiggle room in regards to interpretation.
I would agree with Michael too, but it's an excellent question too, because, but I think in terms of, the criteria for the duration, I mean, if they've had, an eosinophil count in the last year, we would hope that somebody would have been off of it at some point where we could have checked an EO count and captured at that point, but also with 150 for, within the 6 weeks of initiation of therapy, and that's very low. That's actually a very low criteria. And, as a clinician, and again, I'm not saying this with data, but if I look back at a patient and they've had eosinophils in the past before they were on chronic oral corticosteroids, and their EO count has been, 150, which, in my mind as an allergist isn't really that high. But I would still, in my clinical judgment, I thought this patient would benefit from the drug. They're maxed out on inhaled steroids, long-acting bronchodilators, other controllers, and they're still having exacerbations. If they met that criteria, I would go ahead and I would recommend it for them.
Rena.
I had a question about the topic of specialists for the payers. I noticed one of your criteria for the authorization was that the prescription was written by a pulmonologist or allergist, right? So I was wondering, for the patients who don't have easy access to specialists, or even if they were to, be able to get to a specialist once or twice, do all of these monthly injections need to happen in the office of the specialist, or can the prescription be written by the specialist, and then if the patient does okay for the first few times, can the injections then happen in a more realistic or convenient place?
To my understanding, it is permissible as long as the assessment has taken place at that professional level, that continued use of the medication as appropriate be provided, if you will, I can't say lower level of care, but at another level of care closer to the PCM level.
Any other comments on that, Neil?
There's not, as I said, the criteria that our clinical pharmacists use for a whole host of medications that aren't, that have any utilization review criteria are really almost case by case, so we don't have, it has to be going prescribed through a specialist.
Okay, thanks. And Steve, you had a comment on this.
Yeah. So Tony and Neil, you may never want to come back. I keep tossing difficult questions to you. So I just want to note again that, well, we've heard now what the kind of general framework around prior authorization will be. Now, the annual cost of this drug is $32,500, and if the price were set to meet that range between $100,000 to $150,000 per quality, it would be somewhere around a 65 to 75% discount, so somewhere in the range of $8,000 to $12,000. What would happen if the drug had come to market at that price range, or if you had been able to negotiate to that? Maybe you did, but I'm assuming maybe you didn't. What good things would have happened to this drug and to the company that would have priced it that low? And if nothing, why didn't the company just price it higher? Why even come in at $32,500? If nothing's going to get better if they price it substantially lower, just conceptually, why wouldn't they be justified in charging even more if it's not going to change the marketplace?
I don't know if I can answer that.
I told you won't come back.
Okay. All right. I'll keep that in mind, by the way. The considerations that I make at my level are essentially the clinical usefulness of the agent and the like. In terms of pricing per se and the considerations around pricing, I'll have to admit that I'm not as conversant. I would say offhand that certainly, I know negotiations take place, and I know the actual cost may be very different from the WAC cost that's being quoted. In terms of that, though, in affecting the clinical judgments towards the drugs, in terms of affecting the medical authorization criteria per se, it's my charge to make sure that those considerations don't specifically enter in. Again, the pricing of the agent, the negotiations taking place are done at a level different from mine.
I mean, I think the same as, I don't want to get too far out on a limb speaking for our managed care divisions and kind of how they relate to the health plans, but the health plans, the 22 health plans are, they all have their annual budget, and they have to think about the hepatitis C drugs that they are paying for. So clearly, price has an impact. How narrowly you adjust the criteria you want to, obviously, from our level, we're trying to think about the clinician and the patient, bring the best science. But we have hit, we keep talking about it, that sometime society is going to have to deal with the cost. When 40 to 50% of those in state prison have hepatitis C, and we know the cost of it can be upwards of $180,000. For most states, that would be the entire healthcare budget if they treated everyone immediately. So I guess I'm saying that as a public payer, obviously cost has an implication as to the balance of, they have to think of all the medications they need to offer and what price they come in as an opening price does matter. Hepatitis C at a much higher level, we know what impact, because we was in this very room, I think, discussing, it was a week before, I think, another drug, AbbVie came out with a drug, and all of a sudden policies dramatically changed across Medicaid programs. So, Steve, in answer to your question, price does matter as to what, not only health plans, but what public payers can do. Our budget is large, but it is in fact fixed. So it's about $95 billion, and so it is not, we have to work within that, because there's higher education and prisons and the like.
But before we get to the other questions, and I know Paul has one and maybe others, Jeff, you said pricing is a choice.
It is a
Steve says that what if somebody makes a good choice? You come from a supremely integrated healthcare system. How will you reward that good choice?
Well, so when we look at these things, I don't do asthma, but we do neurology drugs. And neurology drugs come, and we actually have a lot to look at. MS drugs are particularly nasty because every time a new one comes out, the price of all of them goes up. So in answer to your question, the price won't go down. They will price themselves up. That's what they do. It's the weirdest thing. So you do look at it, and you give, and actually we say if the drugs are equally efficacious. and it's considerably lower, you know, there's a cost associated. I think that us ignoring, physicians ignoring costs, saying it's not my problem, is not doing any benefit to society. Medicine costs too much, and a big part of why it costs too much is the ever-increasing cost of drugs, and I think it is reasonable. So if you get a company that comes in at a much more reasonable price, they don't get the same level of scrutiny. In general, they won't have the same level of control. We don't have the energy to put huge amounts of this sort of thing. You know, in my organization, the pre-authorization for Botox is I unlock the closet to get out the vial. That's the thing. But we all trust each other that we're doing it in a reasonable way because we have that kind of notion. So, you know, it really does. I mean, people do that because if it's really expensive, you have to say there's limited resources. The world does not have unlimited resources. And I just think that it's kind of, you know, as I said, pricing is a choice. And there seems to be no real relationship to anything other than, you know, what people decide. There was a cartoon one of my colleagues had where there was a group of people sitting around at a, you know, pharmacy thing and said, oh, let's charge $50,000. I don't bet nobody's ever done that before. That was a long time ago. So I think, I mean, I really do think that, you know, thinking about that, I always wonder, you raise the cost, everybody starts worrying about it, managed care companies put restrictions and make it harder for doctors to fill out paperwork to the point where you say, okay, I'll just give up. I mean, you know, and the thing about it is, if it's a more reasonable thing, all of those things kind of tend to be less scrutiny because it's less concern. I think there are actually, believe it or not, physicians that care about this sort of thing, and I think that just, you know, get that message out that it does make sense to have some rational pricing.
Okay.
Can I make one comment
all
about
right.
patient perspective on
Yeah.
cost? Because I think that it's very important as we are seeing the trend to higher deductible plans, that the patient mindset is shifting from a truly patient mindset to a consumer mindset. So price does matter to patients as well. And I think that it's a point that should certainly be considered because I think that that shift is happening more and more dramatically in the last 2 to 3 years than what we've ever seen before. And I can tell you, even in the last quarter of 2015, I heard from multiple patients who were delaying their routine care visits, who were not getting the care that they typically would seek in that fourth quarter of the year because of the high deductible plans.
Thank you. Paul, you had a question.
Yeah, I would say, aside from what the FDA requires, what should be the role of registries, or maybe now we'd say evaluating our database of patients we're treating to be sure we're not having an inappropriate safety signal or some other outcome that we could get from our data, particularly for those where either the benefit is uncertain or for very high-priced drugs where the value is uncertain, and say, well, we're going to pay for this for 2 or 3 years, but we're going to evaluate it 3 years down the road based on this registry/database value. Is that being done? Should that be done?
To a limited extent, that is, and in terms of establishing registries to evaluate long-term quality of care, for instance, and the like, not specifically for this agent, but for others, we actually are establishing programs to do that, that look at the long-term benefit of, for instance, surgical interventions that take place, and what the ultimate outcome is, and we're becoming very outcome-directed in that respect. With respect to this particular agent, we haven't approached that level of scrutiny at this point, but what I will say is that we very carefully reevaluate after certain periods of time, after the first 6-month authorization and then yearly thereafter, to get assurance that the medication is being effective, that exacerbations are indeed controlled, that the patient tolerance of the medication is reasonable. So we don't just authorize once and forget it. What we do is after 6 months, we look at it again and request the information as to efficacy and safety.
Our registry maven has a comment, too.
The R word came up. So, Paul, your question is right on target. In fact, it would be a perfect use of the PCORI net that CALIF is set up with 100 million lives, and you just access the medical records, you query who's on the drug, look at readmissions and all exacerbations, whatever. So it's ripe for the taking.
Well, first Neil, then Luanda, then Michael.
I mean, I think that's a great idea. We're trying to get electronic health records to actually talk to themselves, and even outpatient, inpatient. But Kaiser's been doing work of this type, not necessarily just in medications, but because they have world-renowned research analytic groups in both Oakland and in Portland, and they have great data. They're doing it. But certainly in Medi-Cal, we'd like to do the same thing in our. We have a chief medical information officer that I brought on into the department a few years ago, and I think it's a great idea. We want to strive to do that. I work with Dr. Melnick, UC Davis, and our health services research colleagues in academia would love to do that. So I think it's a great idea.
Wanda, and then Michael.
So I have a two-part question, and the first is basically in some ways related. Actually, both are sort of related into the fact that we have, at this point, very few patients exposed to the drug, even though the data is really interesting, but not a huge number. One is, how big is the overlap between the allergy and severe eosinophilic asthma population?
Well, it's in terms of the adult population?
Mm-hmm. In terms of the folks that would be potentially candidates for this drug.
I mean, again, this is a subset of severe asthma, and I think for the patients who have allergic asthma, I mean, many of them respond quite well to, the standard of care, which we've all talked about here, and are likely candidates for Mepolizumab, and typically those patients do quite well. I think there's definitely a subset of eosinophilic asthma that do not have allergies, and that is, as Michael mentioned, the heterogeneity. I won't say heterogeneity, too, but the different phenotypes there. And it's interesting because some of the patients, and there's even data now published saying that non-allergic patients might actually get better with Mepolizumab, which is, historically we think of as IgE and the allergic antibody, but there's actually probably other benefits of some of these biologics that have not yet been elucidated. So I think there's a lot we still have to learn about this.
Right. Are we concentrating on IgE and EO count just because we have them, or is that really only a fraction of the picture?
Yeah, I think to answer your question, I mean, it depends. If you look at the immune cascade, IgE being a B cell kind of, or related to atopy, with eosinophilia, related to really just eosinophils, there are higher up streams of inflammation that are occurring, and these are the downstream kind of readouts of different levels of inflammation. And so I think we've definitely appreciated that IgE, or Xolair that attacks IgE, is pretty good for identifying subjects that maybe have atopy, but it's not perfect, and some patients definitely respond to Xolair actually who don't have super high IgE levels, and that's why actually having a history of exacerbations is actually a better predictor than IgE for responsiveness to Xolair. Eosinophilia is a little bit different, and it seems to be much more specific to the eosinophil. So targeting that, we would assume, would be more specific, and patients that don't have eosinophilia are less likely, I think, to respond to the drug than, say the Xolair category, and there's probably some overlap. And to get even further, there are drugs coming to market very soon who are going to be higher up. And when you go higher up on the cascade, they probably will be more effective, but they're probably also more likely to have side effects. And so these drugs are probably, or we think, are much safer, but maybe not as efficacious as drugs. And so when we implement these newer drugs, it's going to be important to really understand exactly what the side effects are.
Wanda, your second question?
I would mention, too, that there's also a subgroup of what we call aspirin-exacerbated respiratory disease. And these are the patients who have nasal polyposis, they have asthma, and their symptoms may get worse whether they have asthma, or whether they're taking aspirin or not. these patients often have an eosinophilia in their, when we check them out. And it will be interesting in the future if some of those populations of patients, because often we do aspirin desensitization, which, as everybody knows, aspirin's really cheap, and it's actually effective for many of these patients if they have that picture. But then there's patients who have an eosinophilic asthma patient, eosinophilic asthma who don't have any sinus or polyposis associated with it. So there definitely are subgroups that, as we look deeper, we're finding them out, and there's probably going to be more therapies coming down the road.
Okay. Did you have a second question?
Yeah, so the second question kind of somewhat related to what you guys are alluding to, is that I'm a big fan of biologics, but it's the rare biologic that sort of 6 months to a year down the line that we don't discover some unintended, unimagined effect. And so I'm not going to ask for speculation on that because they are unknown unknowns as opposed to known unknowns. But based on the known unknowns, could you, either of you, speculate on what might be a risk of offset? So if a patient doesn't adhere, they don't show up for their injection, or they're off for a while, is there anything that one could anticipate as a risk aside from just not having as effective control of their asthma?
Like a rebound or something
Yeah.
like that?
Well, they actually, they published a study last year in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology where they actually stopped Mepolizumab, and then they looked at see what happened to patients. And the patients, most of them didn't do well. They did see a lot rise, but it wasn't a rebound effect thought to, but they actually had clinical symptoms, they had exacerbations. So, and again, it's too short and it's too small a number of patients to make any long-term things, but it seems clear that once a patient's on it and they're doing well, if they go off of it, they won't do well. And so, does that sort of answer? Yeah.
Michael, do you concur?
Yeah, I think it's really unknown. I mean, truthfully, we don't entirely know why you get eosinophilia in asthma, period. We don't know exactly why the eosinophil is there. We know it's proxase, and we know it releases a bunch of antioxidants, but it's really unclear exactly what the role of eosinophilia in asthma is outside of an association with asthma. This is the first trial that's clearly shown that it's probably bad, because if you get rid of it with IL-5, which is pretty specific, you get better. But there's the possibility that it's involved in remodeling and other things downstream that actually are beneficial as opposed to detrimental. And so the long-term effects it's unclear.
So we now know, our panel knows that the specialists know precisely how little we know about all of these diseases. I guess that's useful. Before we close, and we're coming right up to the end, there's been a theme sounded a couple of times that I don't want to lose for our write-up, which is Christina said something about, well, if they're not doing well, we'll stop it. And Tony said, well, we'll get 6-month yearly reauthorizations. And obviously that's going to impact the economic analysis, because if you're only treating responders for their lifetime, it has a huge impact on the costs. So can you reliably ascertain who's responding and who isn't and when? You can start.
I actually think this is a big problem in the world of asthma, and probably is a problem actually for most of the biologics, is that when we have a randomized controlled trial, you can say that this group did better than that group. But when you have an individual patient, you don't know what they would have done if they didn't get the drug. And so you're always left with a problem of, well, maybe if I didn't start the drug, they would have had 7 exacerbations, and now they only had 3. And so did they respond or not respond, or if maybe they weren't going to have one anyway. And so you are left with a little bit of a conundrum, if you will, in regards to what to do with the drugs. And this is, I think, why a lot of people have been left on Xolair for extended periods of time, because they don't know what else to do, and maybe you've responded, or maybe you would have had more exacerbations, and people don't really know what to do. Same is true for oral corticosteroids, which we know are very bad. So it's a clear problem. I personally see a lot of patients who have been exposed to very high doses of corticosteroids over decades and have extremely bad consequences of that. And I'm not entirely sure the steroids have done anything beneficial. And so I do think the safety profile here is better, but it's a big problem.
So apparently we need better biomarkers, and hopefully we'll identify them. Christina, did Michael capture the essence of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in my professional practice and for most of my colleagues, I think with at least with the Mepolizumab, which is what we have the most experience with, is after 6 months of no discernible benefit, in any parameter, whether that's quality of life, fewer exacerbations, reduction in other controller medication, all of those things, I mean, the tendency is to stop it. Now, with Mepolizumab, we don't have that long-term data, and that is a question, is sort of, okay, so if I choose to, if a patient, and we discussed this, and they've maxed out on all their environmental controls, very important. We've done asthma education. We've maximized all their current therapy. They start Mepolizumab. We follow them. And then, as Michael said, how long do we have to go to say this has been of benefit compared to what they would have done anyway or what they did the year before? And when do we give it a year and say, okay, if it's really not done anything after a year? Because following their EO count doesn't really help.
Well, usually the response is time will tell, but as Ralph and Paula pointed out, unless we actually collect the data over time, we still won't know in 10 years. So with that, I want to thank our clinical experts and our medical directors, and we have a very short period of time for our CTAF panel reflections on this session, our Mepolizumab discussion, and we can not repeat the general themes that were sounded this morning. But with respect to this specialty medication and this severe illness, with the availability of new drugs coming along and old ones and lack of head-to-head studies, any additional thoughts? We'll start at this side this time.
I just think that we have to be really cautious about the fact that MD prescribing behavior is related to academic detailing. And, just like we were saying that you would only prescribe it if they weren't already on the O drug. And yet our health plan said 6 of the 8 they didn't approve because they were already on the O drug. So it just goes to show that what the specialists think are happening isn't necessarily what's happening in the general prescribing world.
Good point. Any additional thoughts as we go down the table?
Yeah, I'm often asked by my organization to give a summary directed at primary care doctors about what we discuss here, and my summary is make sure you're maximizing standard treatment first.
Okay. Paul?
I was a little struck that given the analysis and the cost per quality, that there still is a general feeling among that this is fairly reasonable, it's being paid for, and so I don't, I'm not sure where the cap price is, and the uncertainty in that is a little surprising to me.
Professor?
I just got to comment on, it's always fascinating when we get to this particular point and we're in general agreement that we're both too early and too late with our addressing the issue at hand. There's always something else coming down the pike here shortly that would change the way we do things here. But we're still wrestling with the same issues, and by and large we're doing it, we're always too late because it's already out there in the wild. And that's the real world that we really do have to deal with here, and it's always really fascinating when we have at least a subgroup. This one's particularly neat because we have such a small subgroup of patients that actually apparently really need this. It's already being prescribed. It's out there. It's on the loose in the formulary. It's like, what, almost what the hell are we doing here, and yet it's a fascinating discussion, and everybody still gets involved with this thing, and we're still finding out, we don't have a system again.
Well, Alex, we'll assume this is another one of the drugs that you help your patients wean off of. But any other thoughts?
This one hit home a little more for me as a father of 2 kids who have asthma. My older one's mostly outgrown it, but my younger one is on more and more controller medications, including chronic inhaled steroids. He's been to the ED every year. Been periods when he's been on oral steroids, month after month after month, and I worry about him and what effect it has. So it's great to see that there is some hope and that there are medications and new classes of medication on the horizon, but the price is just ridiculous. And it would be neat when one day a pharmaceutical company comes up with the idea of, hey, let's price it not at what the market will bear, but let's see if we can get a lot of people to use it and make money on it that way by having a very reasonable price.
What Alex said.
What he said. Okay. Rena, any additional thoughts, reflections?
Well, I definitely echo what Christine said about maximizing standard of care, and also the thought about how we're deliberating it after the price is set. Maybe sometime we could meet while something's under review and come up with a price before it's set.
Wanda?
So this was an interesting, like I said, I'm a fan of biologics and targeted therapy, but it always seems as if they come out a little bit early, and it kind of reinforces how necessary additional surveillance and registries and however we're going to do it in order to actually learn what there is to learn about these drugs.
Marge?
I think for me, the take-home on this one was a fairly intensive discussion about pre-authorization and wondering whether that often is the only way we can deal with the ones where there is such imbalance as to when it might be helpful and when it won't. And of course, then I often wonder, eventually, will the pre-auth requirements come back and bite us?
Meg?
Yeah, I have the same thought about pre-auth, and as someone who's been in the position of pre-authing things, I think this is a case where it's really important and can be useful. And I worry about the scope creep for these particular drugs, and I think it's really important to figure out who the responders are and see where that's going to go, because that's going to change the equation significantly.
Joy, any additional thoughts?
I'm just glad to hear that people seem to be thinking more and more, I think, about opportunity costs and the idea that even if something, seems to have a reasonable cost-effectiveness ratio or doesn't, the issue is also, what could we have spent those resources on instead? What are we trading off? What are we losing by buying this instead? And I think that's always important to keep in mind.
Thank you. Michael?
A theme that we heard this morning and we heard this afternoon as well is a patient's ability to adhere and comply to regimen. And then we added a new toxicity that I think we're going to start talking a lot more about, is a financial toxicity issue. As the Cadillac plans kick in and the deductibles go way up, the ability of a patient to even play this game is going to drop dramatically, and it's not going to be just the traditional underserved. We'll have a new group of underserved. So I think we'll be talking about financial toxicity a lot more as we go forward.
Right. And we know there are patient assistance programs. That's okay. Go ahead, Ralph.
Hard to add anything when you're the last person. I will comment that this is a very exciting area of personalized medicine, and it's incumbent on all of the healthcare system to figure out how to best apply these new advances in the proper and fiscal fashion. And I totally endorse all the comments that Christine made about proper care, that we have so many opportunities for improvement.
Thanks. Mr. Chair.
Chair quotes George H.W. Bush, "Stay tuned." I'm pretty bullish on the science here. We've used steroids for many years, and now we have a biological that seems to be a unique approach to this, and that's exciting. I'm also enthusiastic about the tenor of the panel here. I think this is unique. Americans worship at the altar of innovation. If it's new, it's better. To some extent, if it's more expensive, it's better. This panel doesn't believe that. We were taught as physicians that you put the interests of your patient above all others. Never mind distributive justice, and yet we've heard some very articulate comments about the importance of being aware of costs. So I come away thinking this was pretty terrific today.
Dan, that's great. We're going to try to make sure we've captured all of the great comments in our write-up. We'll be adapting the draft report into our final report, which we expect to come out when?
In about a month from now.
In about a month or less, so if we can do it. That's great. I commend the panel on your attentiveness and energy throughout this whole day. We've been productive, feel good about it. Thank you all very, very much.